Section 13 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 13. The Borgias, Chapter 6, Part 2. When, however, M. de Guise and M. de Tronwy found themselves pressed in this way, they ordered their 200 men-at-arms to turn right about face, while at the opposite end, that is, at the head of the army, Maréchal de Guy and Trévulles ordered a halt and lances in rest. Meanwhile, according to custom, the king, who, as we said, was in the centre, was conferring knighthood on those gentlemen who had earned the favour either by virtue of their personal powers or the king's special friendship. Suddenly there was heard a terrible clash behind. It was the French rearguard coming to blows with the Marquis of Mantua. Where each man had singled out his own foe as though it were a tournament, very many lances were broken, especially those of the Italian knights, for their lances were hollowed so as to be less heavy, and in consequence had less solidity. Those who were thus disarmed at once seized their swords. As they were far more numerous than the French, the king saw them suddenly outflanking his right wing, and apparently prepared to surround it. At the same moment loud cries were heard from a direction facing the centre. This meant that the Stradiotes were crossing the river to make their attack. The king at once ordered his division into two detachments, and giving one to Bourbon the Bastard, to make head against the Stradiotes, he hurried with the second to the rescue of the van, flinging himself into the very midst of the mêlée, striking out like a king, and doing as steady work as the lowest in rank of his captains. Aided by the reinforcement, the rearguard made a good stand, though the enemy were 5 against 1, and the combat in this part continued to rage with wonderful fury. Obeying his orders, Bourbon had thrown himself upon the Stradiotes, but unfortunately, carried off by his horse, he had penetrated so far into the enemy's ranks that he was lost to sight. The disappearance of their chief, the strange dress of their new antagonists, and the peculiar method of their fighting produced a considerable effect on those who were to attack them, and for the moment disorder was the consequence in the centre, and the horsemen scattered instead of serrying their ranks and fighting in a body. This false move would have done them serious harm, had not most of the Stradiotes, seeing the baggage alone and undefended, rushed after that in hope of booty, instead of following up their advantage. A great part of the troop nevertheless stayed behind to fight, pressing on the French cavalry and smashing their lances with fearful scimitars. Happily the king, who had just repulsed the Marquis of Mantua's attack, perceived what was going on behind him, and riding back at all possible speed to the succour of the centre, together with the gentlemen of his household, fell upon the Stradiotes, no longer armed with a lance, for that he had just broken, but brandishing his long sword, which blazed about him like lightning, and, either because he was whirled away like Bourbon by his own horse, or because he had allowed his courage to take him too far, he suddenly found himself in the thickest ranks of the Stradiotes, accompanied only by 8 of the knights he had just now created, one equerry called Antoine des Amboux, and his standard-bearer. "France! France!" he cried aloud, to rally round him all the others who had scattered. They, seeing at last the danger was less than they had supposed, began to take their revenge and to pay back with interest the blows they had received from the Stradiotes. Things were going still better for the van which the Marquis de Cajazzo was to attack, for although he had at first appeared to be animated with a terrible purpose, he stopped short about 10 or 12 feet from the French line, and turned right about face without breaking a single lance. The French wanted to pursue, but the Maréchal de Guy, fearing that this fight might be only a trick to draw off the vanguard from the centre, ordered every man to stay in his place. But the Swiss, who were German, and did not understand the order, or thought it was not meant for them, followed upon their heels, and although on foot, caught them up and killed 100 of them. This was quite enough to throw them into disorder, so that some were scattered about the plain, and others made a rush for the water, so as to cross the river and rejoin their camp. When the Maréchal de Guy saw this, he detached 100 of his own men to go to the aid of the king, who was continuing to fight with unheard-of courage, and running the greatest risks, constantly separated as he was from his gentlemen, who could not follow him, for wherever there was danger, thither he rushed with his cry of "France!" little troubling himself as to whether he was followed or not. And it was no longer with his sword that he fought, that he had long ago broken, like his lance, but with a heavy battle axe, whose every blow was mortal whether cut or pierced. Thus the Stradiotes, already hard pressed by the king's household and his pensioners, soon changed attack for defence, and defence for flight. It was at this moment that the king was really in the greatest danger, for he had let himself be carried away in pursuit of the fugitives, and presently found himself all alone, surrounded by these men, who, had they not been struck with a mighty terror, would have had nothing to do but unite and crush him and his horse together. But, as Commynes remarks, he whom God guards is well guarded, and God was guarding the King of France. All the same, at this moment the French were sorely pressed in the rear, and although de Guise and de la Tremouille held out as firmly as it was possible to hold, they would probably have been compelled to yield to superior numbers had not a double aid arrived in time. First the indefatigable Charles, who, having nothing more to do amongst the fugitives, once again dashed into the midst of the fight. Next the servants of the army, who, now that they were set free from the Stradiotes and saw their enemies put to flight, ran up armed with the axes they habitually used to cut down wood for building their huts. They burst into the middle of the fray, slashing at the horses' legs and dealing heavy blows that smashed in the visors of the dismounted horsemen. The Italians could not hold out against this double attack. The Furia Francese rendered all their strategy and all their calculations useless, especially as for more than a century they had abandoned their fights of blood and fury for a kind of tournament they chose to regard as warfare. So, in spite of all Gonzaga's efforts, they turned their backs upon the French rear and took to flight. In the greatest haste and with much difficulty they recrossed the torrent, which was swollen even more now by the rain that had been falling during the whole time of the battle. Some thought fit to pursue the vanquished, for there was now such disorder in their ranks that they were fleeing in all directions from the battlefield where the French had gained so glorious a victory, blocking up the roads to Parma and Bercetto. But Maréchal de Guise and de Tremouille, who had done quite enough to save them from the suspicion of quailing before imaginary dangers, put a stop to this enthusiasm, by pointing out that it would only be risking the loss of their present advantage if they tried to push it farther with men and horses so worn out. This view was adopted in spite of the opinion of Trevulles, Camillo Vitelli, and Francesco Secco, who were all eager to follow up the victory. The king retired to a little village on the left bank of the Taro, and took shelter in a poor house. There he disarmed, being perhaps among all the captains and all the soldiers the man who had fought best. During the night the torrent swelled so high the Italian army could not have pursued, even if they had laid aside their fears. The king did not propose to give the appearance of fight after a victory, and therefore kept his army drawn up all day, and at night went on to sleep at Medesano, a little village only a mile lower down than the hamlet where he rested after the fight. But in the course of the night he reflected that he had done enough for the honour of his arms in fighting an army 4 times as great as his own, and killing 3,000 men, and then waiting a day and a half to give them time to take their revenge. So 2 hours before daybreak he had the fires lighted, that the enemy might suppose he was remaining in camp, and every man mounting noiselessly, the whole French army, almost out of danger by this time, proceeded on their march to Borgo San Donnino. While this was going on, the Pope returned to Rome, where news highly favourable to his schemes was not slow to reach his ears. He learned that Ferdinand had crossed from Sicily into Calabria with 6,000 volunteers and a considerable number of Spanish horse and foot, led, at the command of Ferdinand and Isabella, by the famous Gonzaga de Cordova, who arrived in Italy with a great reputation, destined to suffer somewhat from the defeat at Seminara. At almost the same time the French fleet had been beaten by the Aragonese. Moreover, the battle of the Taro, though a complete defeat for the Confederates, was another victory for the Pope, because its result was to open a return to France for that man whom he regarded as his deadliest foe. So, feeling that he had nothing more to fear from Charles, he sent him a brief at Turin, where he had stopped for a short time to give aid to Novara, therein commanding him, by virtue of his pontifical authority, to depart out of Italy with his army, and to recall within 10 days those of his troops that still remained in the kingdom of Naples, on pain of excommunication, and a summons to appear before him in person. Charles VIII replied, 1. That he did not understand how the Pope, the chief of the League, ordered him to leave Italy, whereas the confederates had not only refused him a passage, but had even attempted, though unsuccessfully, as perhaps his Holiness knew, to cut off his return into France. 2. That as to recalling his troops from Naples, he was not so irreligious as to do that, since they had not entered the kingdom without the consent and blessing of his Holiness. 3. That he was exceedingly surprised that the Pope should require his presence in person at the capital of the Christian world just at the present time, when 6 weeks previously, at the time of his return from Naples, although he ardently desired an interview with his Holiness, that he might offer proofs of his respect and obedience, his Holiness, instead of according this favour, had quitted Rome so hastily on his approach that he had not been able to come up with him by any efforts whatsoever. On this point, however, he promised to give his Holiness the satisfaction he desired, if he would engage this time to wait for him. He would therefore return to Rome as soon as the affairs that brought him back to his own kingdom had been satisfactorily settled. Although in this reply there was a touch of mockery and defiance, Charles was none the less compelled by the circumstances of the case to obey the Pope's strange brief. His presence was so much needed in France that, in spite of the arrival of a Swiss reinforcement, he was compelled to conclude a peace with Ludovico Sforza, whereby he yielded Novara to him, while Gilbert de Montpensier and d'Aubigny, after defending, inch by inch, Calabria, the Basilicate, and Naples, were obliged to sign the capitulation of Atella after a siege of 32 days, on the 20th of July, 1496. This involved giving back to Ferdinand II., King of Naples, all the palaces and fortresses of his kingdom, which indeed he did but enjoy for 3 months, dying of exhaustion on the 7th of September following, at the Castello della Somma, at the foot of Vesuvius. All the attentions lavished upon him by his young wife could not repair the evil that her beauty had wrought. His uncle Frederick succeeded, and so, in the 3 years of his papacy, Alexander VI had seen 5 kings upon the throne of Naples, while he was establishing himself more firmly upon his own pontifical seat: Ferdinand I, Alfonso I, Charles VIII, Ferdinand II, and Frederick. All this agitation about his throne, the rapid succession of sovereigns, was the best thing possible for Alexander, for each new monarch became actually king only on condition of his receiving the pontifical investiture. The consequence was that Alexander was the only gainer in power and credit by these changes, for the Duke of Milan and the republics of Florence and Venice had successively recognized him as supreme head of the Church, in spite of his simony. Moreover, the 5 kings of Naples had in turn paid him homage. So he thought the time had now come for founding a mighty family, and for this he relied upon the Duke of Gandia, who was to hold all the highest temporal dignities, and upon Caesar Borgia, who was to be appointed to all the great ecclesiastical offices. The Pope made sure of the success of these new projects by electing 4 Spanish cardinals, who brought up the number of his compatriots in the Sacred College to 22, thus assuring him a constant and certain majority. The first requirement of the Pope's policy was to clear away from the neighbourhood of Rome all those petty lords whom most people call vicars of the Church, but whom Alexander called the shackles of the Papacy. We saw that he had already begun this work by rousing the Orsini against the Colonna family, when Charles VIII enterprise compelled him to concentrate all his mental resources, and also all the forces of his state, so as to secure his own personal safety. It had come about through their own imprudent action that the Orsini, the Pope's old friends, were now in the pay of the French, and had entered the kingdom of Naples with them, where one of them, Virginio, a very important member of their powerful house, had been taken prisoner during the war, and was Ferdinand II's captive. Alexander could not let this opportunity escape him, so, first ordering the King of Naples not to release a man who, ever since the 1st of June 1496, had been a declared rebel, he pronounced a sentence of confiscation against Virginio Orsini and his whole family in a secret consistory, which sat on the 26th of October following, that is to say, in the early days of the reign of Frederick, whom he knew to be entirely at his command, owing to the king's great desire of getting the investiture from them. Then, as it was not enough to declare the goods confiscated without also dispossessing the owners, he made overtures to the Colonna family, saying he would commission them, in proof of their new bond of friendship, to execute the order given against their old enemies under the direction of his son Francesco, Duke of Gandia. In this fashion he contrived to weaken his neighbours each by means of the other, till such time as he could safely attack and put an end to conquered and conqueror alike. The Colonna family accepted this proposition, and the Duke of Gandia was named General of the Church. His father in his pontifical robes bestowed on him the insignia of this office in the Church of St. Peter's at Rome. Section 13.
Section 14 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 14. The Borgias. Chapter 7, Part 1. Matters went forward as Alexander had wished, and before the end of the year the pontifical army had seized a great number of castles and fortresses that belonged to the Orsini, who thought themselves already lost when Charles VIII came to the rescue. They had addressed themselves to him without much hope that he could be of real use to them, with his want of armed troops and his preoccupation with his own affairs. He, however, sent Carlo Orsini, son of Virginio the prisoner, and Vitellozzo Vitelli, brother of Camillo Vitelli, one of the 3 valiant Italian condottieri who had joined him and fought for him at the crossing of the Taro. These 2 captains, whose courage and skill were well known, brought with them a considerable sum of money from the liberal coffers of Charles VIII. Now scarcely had they arrived at Citta di Castello, the centre of their little sovereignty, and expressed their intention of raising a band of soldiers, when men presented themselves from all sides to fight under their banner. So they very soon assembled a small army, and as they had been able during their stay among the French to study those matters of military organization in which France excelled, they now applied the result of their learning to their own troops. The improvements were mainly certain changes in the artillery, which made their manoeuvres easier, and the substitution for their ordinary weapons of pikes similar in form to the Swiss pikes, but 2 feet longer. These changes effected, Vitellozzo Vitelli spent 3 or 4 months in exercising his men in the management of their new weapons. Then, when he thought them fit to make good use of these, and when he had collected more or less help from the towns of Perugia, Todi, and Narni, where the inhabitants trembled lest their turn should come after the Orsinis, as the Orsinis had followed on the Colonnas, he marched towards Bracciano, which was being besieged by the Duke of Urbino, who had been lent to the Pope by the Venetians in virtue of the treaty quoted above. The Venetian general, when he heard of Vitelli's approach, thought he might as well spare him half his journey, and marched out to confront him. The 2 armies met in the Soriano road, and the battle straightway began. The pontifical army had a body of 800 Germans, on which the Dukes of Urbino and Gandia chiefly relied, as well they might, for they were the best troops in the world. But Vitelli attacked these picked men with his infantry, who, armed with their formidable pikes, ran them through, while they, with arms 4 feet shorter, had no chance even of returning the blows they received. At the same time Vitelli's light troops wheeled upon the flank, following their most rapid movements, and silencing the enemy's artillery by the swiftness and accuracy of their attack. The pontifical troops were put to flight, though after a longer resistance than might have been expected when they had to sustain the attack of an army so much better equipped than their own. With them they bore to Ronciglione the Duke of Gandia, wounded in the face by a pike thrust, Fabrizia Colonna, and the envoy. The Duke of Urbino, who was fighting in the rear to aid the retreat, was taken prisoner with all his artillery and the baggage of the conquered army. But this success, great as it was, did not so swell the pride of Vitellozzo Vitelli as to make him oblivious of his position. He knew that he and the Orsini together were too weak to sustain a war of such magnitude; that the little store of money to which he owed the existence of his army would very soon be expended, and his army would disappear with it. So he hastened to get pardoned for the victory by making propositions which he would very likely have refused had he been the vanquished party; and the Pope accepted his conditions without demur. During the interval, having heard that Trivulzio had just recrossed the Alps and re-entered Italy with 3,000 Swiss, and fearing lest the Italian general might only be the advance guard of the King of France. So it was settled that the Orsini should pay 70,000 florins for the expenses of the war, and that all the prisoners on both sides should be exchanged without ransom, with the single exception of the Duke of Urbino. As a pledge for the future payment of the 70,000 florins, the Orsini handed over to the Cardinals Sforza and San Severino the fortresses of Anguillara and Cervetri. Then, when the day came and they had not the necessary money, they gave up their prisoner, the Duke of Urbino, estimating his worth at 40,000 ducats, nearly all the sum required, and handed him over to Alexandre on account. He, a rigid observer of engagements, made his own general, taken prisoner in his service, pay to himself the ransom he owed to the enemy. Then the Pope had the corpse of Virginio sent to Carlo Orsini and Vitellozzo Vitelli, as he could not send him alive. By a strange fatality the prisoner had died, 8 days before the treaty was signed, of the same malady, at least if we may judge by analogy, that had carried off Bajazet's brother. As soon as the peace was signed, Prospero Colonna and Gonzalvo de Cordova, whom the Pope had demanded from Frederick, arrived at Rome with an army of Spanish and Neapolitan troops. Alexander, as he could not utilize these against the Orsini, set them the work of recapturing Ostia, not desiring to incur the reproach of bringing them to Rome for nothing. Gonzalvo was rewarded for this feat by receiving the Rose of Gold from the Pope's hand, that being the highest honor His Holiness can grant. He shared this distinction with the Emperor Maximilian, the King of France, the Doge of Venice, and the Marquis of Mantua. In the midst of all this occurred the solemn festival of the Assumption, in which Gonzalvo was invited to take part. He accordingly left his palace, proceeded in great pomp in the front of the pontifical cavalry, and took his place on the Duke of Gandia's left hand. The Duke attracted all eyes by his personal beauty, set off as it was by all the luxury he thought fit to display at this festival. He had a retinue of pages and servants clad in sumptuous liveries, incomparable for richness with anything heretofore seen in Rome, that city of religious pomp. All these pages and servants rode magnificent horses caparisoned in velvet, trimmed with silver fringe, and bells of silver hanging down every here and there. He himself was in a robe of gold brocade, and wore at his neck a string of Eastern pearls, perhaps the finest and largest that ever belonged to a Christian prince, while on his cap was a gold chain studded with diamonds, of which the smallest was worth more than 20,000 ducats. This magnificence was all the more conspicuous by the contrast it presented to Cæsar's dress, whose scarlet robe admitted of no ornaments. The result was that Cæsar, doubly jealous of his brother, felt a new hatred rise up within him when he heard all along the way the praises of his fine appearance and noble equipment. From this moment Cardinal Valentino decided in his own mind the fate of this man, this constant obstacle in the path of his pride, his love, and his ambition. Very good reason, says Tommaso the historian, had the Duke of Gandia to leave behind him an impression on the public mind of his beauty and his grandeur at this fete, for this last display was soon to be followed by the obsequies of the unhappy young man. Lucrezia also had come to Rome on the pretext of taking part in the solemnity, but really, as we shall see later, with the view of serving as a new instrument for her father's ambition. As the Pope was not satisfied with an empty triumph of vanity and display for his son, and as his war with the Orsini had failed to produce the anticipated results, he decided to increase the fortune of his firstborn by doing the very thing which he had accused Calixtus in his speech of doing for him, viz., alienating from the States of the Church the cities of Benevento, Terracino, and Pontecorvo, to form a duchy as an appanage to his son's house. Accordingly, this proposition was put forward in a full consistory, and, as the College of Cardinals was entirely Alexander's, there was no difficulty about carrying his point. This new favor to his elder brother exasperated Caesar, although he was himself getting a share of the paternal gifts, for he had just been named envoy a latere at Frederick's court, and was appointed to crown him with his own hands as the papal representative. But Lucrezia, when she had spent a few days of pleasure with her father and brothers, had gone into retreat at the convent of San Sisto. No one knew the real motive of her seclusion, and no entreaties of Caesar, whose love for her was strange and unnatural, had induced her to defer this departure from the world even until the day after he left for Naples. His sister's obstinacy wounded him deeply, for ever since the day when the Duke of Gandia had appeared in the procession so magnificently attired, he fancied he had observed a coldness in the mistress of his illicit affection, and so far did this increase his hatred of his rival, that he resolved to be rid of him at all costs. So he ordered the chief of his sbirri to come and see him the same night. Micheletto was accustomed to these mysterious messages, which almost always meant his help was wanted in some love affair or some act of revenge. As in either case his reward was generally a large one, he was careful to keep his engagement, and at the appointed hour was brought into the presence of his patron. Caesar received him leaning against a tall chimney-piece, no longer wearing his cardinal's robe and hat, but a doublet of black velvet slashed with satin of the same color. One hand toyed mechanically with his gloves, while the other rested on the handle of a poisoned dagger which never left his side. This was the dress he kept for his nocturnal expeditions, so Micheletto felt no surprise at that. But his eyes burned with a flame more gloomy than their wont, and his cheeks, generally pale, were now livid. Micheletto had but to cast one look upon his master to see that Caesar and he were about to share some terrible enterprise. He signed to him to shut the door. Micheletto obeyed. Then, after a moment's silence, during which the eyes of Borgia seemed to burn into the soul of the bravo, who with a careless air stood bareheaded before him, he said, in a voice whose slightly mocking tone gave the only sign of his emotion, "Micheletto, how do you think this dress suits me?" Accustomed as he was to his master's tricks of circumlocution, the bravo was so far from expecting this question, that at first he stood mute, and only after a few moments' pause was able to say, "Admirably, Monsignore. Thanks to the dress, your Excellency has the appearance as well as the true spirit of a captain." "I am glad you think so," replied Caesar. "And now let me ask you, do you know who is the cause that, instead of wearing this dress, which I can only put on at night, I am forced to disguise myself in the daytime in a cardinal's robe and hat, and pass my time trotting about from church to church, from consistory to consistory, when I ought properly to be leading a magnificent army in the battlefield, where you would enjoy a captain's rank, instead of being the chief of a few miserable sbirri?" "Yes, Monsignore," replied Micheletto, who had divined Caesar's meaning at his first word. The man who is the cause of this is Francesco, Duke of Gandia and Benevento, your elder brother. Do you know," Caesar resumed, giving no sign of assent, but a nod and a bitter smile, "do you know who has all the money and none of the genius, who has the helmet and none of the brains, who has the sword and no hand to wield it?" "That, too, is the Duke of Gandia," said Michelotto. "Do you know," continued Caesar, "who is the man whom I find continually blocking the path of my ambition, my fortune, and my love?" "It is the same, the Duke of Gandia," said Michelotto. "And what do you think of it?" asked Caesar. "I think he must die," replied the man coldly. "That is my opinion also, Michelotto," said Caesar, stepping towards him and grasping his hand. "And my only regret is that I did not think of it sooner; for if I had carried a sword at my side instead of a crosier in my hand when the King of France was marching through Italy, I should now have been the master of a fine domain. The Pope is obviously anxious to aggrandize his family, but he is mistaken in the means he adopts. It is I who ought to have been made Duke, and my brother a Cardinal. There is no doubt at all that, had he made me Duke, I should have contributed a daring and courage to his service that would have made his power far weightier than it is. The man who would make his way to vast dominions and a kingdom ought to trample under foot all the obstacles in his path, and boldly grasp the very sharpest thorns, whatever reluctance his weak flesh may feel. Such a man, if he would open out his path to fortune, should seize his dagger or his sword, and strike out with his eyes shut. He should not shrink from bathing his hands in the blood of his kindred. He should follow the example offered him by every founder of empire, from Romulus to Bajazet, both of whom climbed to the throne by the ladder of fratricide. Yes, Michelotto, as you say, such is my condition, and I am resolved I will not shrink. Now you know why I sent for you. Am I wrong in counting upon you?" As might have been expected, Michelotto, seeing his own fortune in this crime, replied that he was entirely at Caesar's service, and that he had nothing to do but to give his orders as to time, place, and manner of execution. Caesar replied that the time must needs be very soon, since he was on the point of leaving Rome for Naples. As to the place and the mode of execution, they would depend on circumstances, and each of them must look out for an opportunity and seize the first that seemed favorable. End of Section 14. Section 15 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 15, The Borgias, Chapter 7, Part 2. 2 days after this resolution had been taken, Caesar learned that the day of his departure was fixed for Thursday, the 15th of June. At the same time he received an invitation from his mother to come to supper with her on the 14th. This was a farewell repast given in his honor. Michelotto received orders to be in readiness at 11 o'clock at night. The table was set in the open air in a magnificent vineyard, a property of Rosa Venozza's, in the neighborhood of San Piero in Vinculus. The guests were Caesar Borgia, the hero of the occasion, the Duke of Gandia, the Prince of Squillace, Donna Sancha, his wife, the Cardinal of Montereale, Francesco Borgia, son of Calixtus III., Don Rodrigo Borgia, captain of the Apostolic Palace, Don Goffredo, brother of the Cardinal, Gian Borgia, at that time the ambassador at Perugia, and lastly Don Alfonso Borgia, the Pope's nephew. The whole family, therefore, was present, except Lucrezia, who was still in retreat, and would not come. The repast was magnificent. Caesar was quite as cheerful as usual, and the Duke of Gandia seemed more joyous than he had ever been before. In the middle of supper a man in a mask brought him a letter. The Duke unfastened it, coloring up with pleasure, and when he had read it, answered in these words, "I will come." Then he quickly hid the letter in the pocket of his doublet; but, quick as he was to conceal it from every eye, Caesar had had time to cast a glance that way, and he fancied he recognized the handwriting of his sister Lucrezia. Meanwhile the messenger had gone off with his answer, no one but Caesar paying the slightest attention to him, for at that period it was the custom for messages to be conveyed by men in domino, or by women whose faces were concealed by a veil. At 10 o'clock they rose from the table, and, as the air was sweet and mild, they walked about a while under the magnificent pine trees that shaded the house of Rosa Venozza, while Caesar never for an instant let his brother out of his sight. At 11 o'clock the Duke of Gandia bade good night to his mother. Caesar at once followed suit, alleging his desire to go to the Vatican to bid farewell to the Pope, as he would not be able to fulfil this duty on the morrow, his departure being fixed at daybreak. This pretext was all the more plausible, since the Pope was in the habit of sitting up every night till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. The two brothers went out together, mounted their horses, which were waiting for them at the door, and rode side by side as far as the Palazzo Borgia, the present home of Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, who had taken it as a gift from Alexandre the night before his election to the papacy. There the Duke of Gandia separated from his brother, saying with a smile that he was not intending to go home, as he had several hours to spend first with a fair lady who was expecting him. Caesar replied that he was no doubt free to make any use he liked best of his opportunities, and wished him a very good night. The Duke turned to the right, and Caesar to the left; but Caesar observed that the street the Duke had taken led in the direction of the convent of San Sisto, where, as we said, Lucrezia was in retreat. His suspicions were confirmed by this observation, and he directed his horse's steps to the Vatican, found the Pope, took his leave of him, and received his benediction. From this moment all is wrapped in mystery and darkness, like that in which the terrible deed was done that we are now to relate. This, however, is what is believed. The Duke of Gandia, when he quitted Caesar, sent away his servants, and, in the company of one confidential valet alone, pursued his course towards the Piazza della Giudecca. There he found the same man in a mask who had come to speak to him at supper, and, forbidding his valet to follow any farther, he bade him wait on the piazza where they then stood, promising to be on his way back in 2 hours' time at latest, and to take him up as he passed. And at the appointed hour the Duke reappeared, took leave this time of the man in the mask, and retraced his steps towards his palace. But scarcely had he turned the corner of the Jewish Ghetto, when 4 men on foot, led by a 5th who was on horseback, flung themselves upon him. Thinking they were thieves, or else that he was the victim of some mistake, the Duke of Gandia mentioned his name; but instead of the name checking the murderers' daggers, their strokes were redoubled, and the Duke very soon fell dead, his valet dying beside him. Then the man on horseback, who had watched the assassination with no sign of emotion, backed his horse towards the dead body. The 4 murderers lifted the corpse across the crupper, and, walking side by side to support it, then made their way down the lane that leads to the church of Santa Maria in Monticelli. The wretched valet they left for dead upon the pavement. But he, after a lapse of a few seconds, regained some small strength, and his groans were heard by the inhabitants of a poor little house hard by. They came and picked him up, and laid him upon a bed, where he died almost at once, unable to give any evidence as to the assassins, or any details of the murder. All night the Duke was expected home, and all the next morning. Then expectation was turned into fear, and fear at last into deadly terror. The Pope was approached, and told that the Duke of Gandia had never come back to his palace since he left his mother's house. But Alexander tried to deceive himself all through the rest of the day, hoping that his son might have been surprised by the coming of daylight in the midst of an amorous adventure, and was waiting till the next night to get away in that darkness which had aided his coming thither. But the night, like the day, passed, and brought no news. On the morrow the Pope, tormented by the gloomiest presentiments and by the raven's croak of the vox populi, let himself fall into the depths of despair. Amid sighs and sobs of grief, all he could say to any one who came to him was but these words, repeated 1,000 times: "Search, search. Let us know how my unhappy son has died." Then everybody joined in the search, for, as we have said, the Duke of Gandia was beloved by all; but nothing could be discovered from scouring the town except the body of the murdered man, who was recognized as the Duke's valet. Of his master there was no trace whatever. It was then thought, not without reason, that he had probably been thrown into the Tiber, and they began to follow along its banks, beginning from the Via della Ripetta, questioning every boatman and fisherman who might possibly have seen, either from their houses or from their boats, what had happened on the river banks during the 2 preceding nights. At first all inquiries were in vain; but when they had gone up as high as the Via del Fantanone, they found a man at last who said he had seen something happen on the night of the 14th, which might very possibly have some bearing on the subject of the inquiry. He was a Slav named George, who was taking up the river a boat laden with wood to Ripetta. The following are his own words: "Gentlemen," he said, "last Wednesday evening, when I had set down my load of wood on the bank, I remained in my boat, resting in the cool night air, and watching lest other men should come and take away what I had just unloaded, when, about 2 o'clock in the morning, I saw coming out of the lane on the left of San Girolamo's church 2 men on foot, who came forward in the middle of the street, and looked so carefully all around that they seemed to have come to find out if anybody was going along the street. When they felt sure that it was deserted, they went back along the same lane, whence issued presently 2 other men, who used similar precautions to make sure that there was nothing fresh. They, when they found all as they wished, gave a sign to their companions to come and join them. Next appeared one man on a dapple gray horse, which was carrying on the crupper the body of a dead man, his head and arms hanging over on one side, and his feet on the other. The 2 fellows I had first seen exploring were holding him up by the arms and legs. The other 3 at once went up to the river, while the first 2 kept a watch on the street, and, advancing to the part of the bank where the sewers of the town are discharged into the Tiber, the horseman turned his horse, backing on the river. Then the 2 who were at either side, taking the corpse, one by the hands, the other by the feet, swung it 3 times, and the 3rd time threw it out into the river with all their strength. Then, at the noise made when the body splashed into the river, the horseman asked, "Is it done?" And the others answered, "Yes, sir," and he at once turned right about face. But seeing the dead man's cloak floating, he asked, what was that black thing swimming about? "Sir," said one of the men, "it is his cloak." And then another man picked up some stones, and running to the place where it was still floating, threw them so as to make it sink under. As soon as it had quite disappeared, they went off, and after walking a little way along the main road, they went into the lane that leads to San Giacomo. That was all I saw, gentlemen, and so it is all I can answer to the questions you have asked me." At these words, which robbed of all hope any who might yet entertain it, one of the Pope's servants asked the Slav why, when he was witness of such a deed, he had not gone to denounce it to the Governor. But the Slav replied that, since he had exercised his present trade on the river side, he had seen dead men thrown into the Tiber in the same way 100 times, and had never heard that anybody had been troubled about them. So he supposed it would be the same with this corpse as the others, and had never imagined it was his duty to speak of it, not thinking it would be any more important than it had been before. Acting on this intelligence, the servants of his Holiness summoned at once all boatmen and fishermen who were accustomed to go up and down the river; and, as a large reward was promised to any one who should find the Duke's body, there were soon more than 100 ready for the job; so that before the evening of the same day, which was Friday, 2 men were drawn out of the water, of whom one was instantly recognized as the hapless Duke. At the very first glance at the body there could be no doubt as to the cause of death. It was pierced with 9 wounds, the chief one in the throat, whose artery was cut. The clothing had not been touched. His doublet and cloak were there, his gloves in his waistband, gold in his purse. The Duke, then, must have been assassinated, not for gain, but for revenge. The ship which carried the corpse went up the Tiber to the Castello Sant' Angelo, where it was set down. At once the magnificent dress was fetched from the Duke's palace, which he had worn on the day of the procession, and he was clothed in it once more. Beside him were placed the insignia of the generalship of the Church. Thus he lay in state all day, but his father, in his despair, had not the courage to come and look at him. At last, when night had fallen, his most trusty and honored servants carried the body to the Church of the Madonna del Popolo, with all the pomp and ceremony that Church and State combined could devise for the funeral of the son of the Pope. Meantime, the blood-stained hands of Caesar Borgia were placing a royal crown upon the head of Frederick of Aragon. This blow had pierced Alexander's heart very deeply. As at first he did not know on whom his suspicions should fall, he gave the strictest orders for the pursuit of the murderers. But little by little the infamous truth was forced upon him. He saw that the blow which struck at his house came from that very house itself, and then his despair was changed to madness. He ran through the rooms of the Vatican like a maniac, and, entering the consistory with torn garments and ashes on his head, he sobbingly avowed all the errors of his past life, owning that the disaster that struck his offspring through his offspring was a just chastisement from God. Then he retired to a secret dark chamber of the palace, and there shut himself up, declaring his resolve to die of starvation. And indeed, for more than 60 hours he took no nourishment by day nor rest by night, making no answer to those who knocked at his door to bring him food, except with the wailings of a woman, or a roar as of a wounded lion. Even the beautiful Julia Farnese, his new mistress, could not move him at all, and was obliged to go and seek Lucrezia, that daughter doubly loved, to conquer his deadly resolve. Lucrezia came out from the retreat where she was weeping for the Duke of Gandia, that she might console her father. At her voice the door did really open, and it was only then that the Duke of Segovia, who had been kneeling almost a whole day at the threshold, begging his Holiness to take heart, could enter with servants bearing wine and food. The Pope remained alone with Lucrezia for 3 days and nights. Then he reappeared in public, outwardly calm, if not resigned; for Guicciardini assures us that his daughter had made him understand how dangerous it would be to himself to show too openly before the assassin, who was coming home, the immoderate love he felt for his victim. End of Section 15.
Section 16 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Eves. Section 16, The Borgias, Chapter 8. Caesar remained at Naples, partly to give time to the paternal grief to cool down, and partly to get on with another business he had lately been charged with, nothing else than a proposition of marriage between Lucrezia and Don Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bicelli and Prince of Salerno, natural son of Alfonso II and brother of Donna Sancha. It was true that Lucrezia was already married to the Lord of Pesaro, but she was the daughter of an father who had received from heaven the right of uniting and disuniting. There was no need to trouble about so trifling a matter. When the two were ready to marry, the divorce would be effected. Alexandre was too good a tactician to leave his daughter married to a son-in-law who was becoming useless to him. Towards the end of August, it was announced that the ambassador was coming back to Rome, having accomplished his mission to the new king to his great satisfaction. And thither he returned on the 5th of September, that is, nearly 3 months after the Duke of Gandia's death, and on the next day, the 6th, from the church of Santa Maria Novella, where, according to custom, the cardinals and the Spanish and Venetian ambassadors were awaiting him on horseback at the door, he proceeded to the Vatican, where His Holiness was sitting. There he entered the consistory, was admitted by the Pope, and in accordance with the usual ceremonial received his benediction and keys. Then, accompanied once more in the same fashion by the ambassadors and cardinals, he was escorted to his own apartments. Thence he proceeded to the Pope's as soon as he was left alone, for at the consistory they had had no speech with one another, and the father and son had 100 things to talk about, but of these the Duke of Gandia was not one, as might have been expected. His name was not once spoken, and neither on that day nor afterwards was there ever again any mention of the unhappy young man. It was as though he had never existed. It was the fact that Caesar brought good news. King Frederick gave his consent to the proposed union, so the marriage of Sforza and Lucrezia was dissolved on a pretext of nullity. Then Frederick authorized the exhumation of Jem's body, which, it will be remembered, was worth 300,000 ducats. After this, all came about as Caesar had desired. He became the man who was all-powerful after the Pope, but when he was second in command, it was soon evident to the Roman people that their city was making a new stride in the direction of ruin. There was nothing but balls, fetes, masquerades. There were magnificent hunting parties, when Caesar, who had begun to cast off its cardinal's robes, weary perhaps of the couleur, appeared in a French dress, followed like a king by cardinals, envoys, and bodyguard. The whole pontifical town, given up like a courtesan to orgies and debauchery, had ever been more the home of sedition, luxury, and carnage, according to the Cardinal of Viterbo, not even in the days of Nero and Heliogabalus. Never had she fallen upon days more evil. Never had more traitors done her dishonour, or sbirri stained her streets with blood. The number of thieves was so great, and their audacity such, that no one could with safety pass the gates of the town. Soon it was not even safe within them. No house, no castle, availed the defence. Right and justice no longer existed. Money, fairs, pleasure ruled supreme. Still the gold was melting, as in a furnace, at these fetes, and, by heaven's just punishment, Alexander and Caesar were beginning to covet the fortunes of those very men who had risen through their simony to the present elevation. The first attempt at a new method of coining money was tried upon the Cardinal Coscienza. The occasion was as follows. A certain dispensation had been granted some time before to a nun who had taken the vows. She was the only surviving heir to the throne of Portugal, and by means of the dispensation she had been wedded to the natural son of the last king. This marriage was more prejudicial than can easily be imagined to the interests of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. So they sent ambassadors to Alexander to lodge a complaint against a proceeding of this nature, especially as it happened at the very moment when an alliance was to be formed between the House of Aragon and the Holy See. Alexander understood the complaint, and resolved that all should be set right. So he denied all knowledge of the papal brief, though he had as a fact received 60,000 ducats for signing it, and accused the Archbishop of Cosenza, secretary for apostolic briefs, of having granted a false dispensation. By reason of this accusation, the archbishop was taken to the castle of Sant Angelo, and a suit was begun. But as it was no easy task to prove an accusation of this nature, especially if the archbishop should persist in maintaining that the dispensation was really granted by the pope, it was resolved to employ a trick with him which could not fail to succeed. One evening the Archbishop of Cosenza saw Cardinal Valentino come into his prison. With that frank air of affability which he well knew how to assume when it could serve his purpose, he explained to the prisoner the embarrassing situation in which the Pope was placed, from which the Archbishop alone, whom His Holiness looked upon as his best friend, could save him. The Archbishop replied that he was entirely at the service of His Holiness. Caesar, on his entrance, found the captive seated, leaning his elbows on the table, and he took a seat opposite him, and explained the Pope's position. It was an embarrassing one. At the very time of contracting so important an alliance with the House of Aragon as that of Lucrezia and Alfonso, His Holiness could not avow to Ferdinand and Isabella that, for the sake of a few miserable ducats, he had signed a dispensation which would unite in the husband and wife together all the legitimate claims to a throne to which Ferdinand and Isabella had no right at all but that of conquest. This avowal would necessarily put an end to all negotiations, and the pontifical house would fall by the overthrow of that very pedestal which was to have heightened its grandeur. Accordingly, the Archbishop would understand that the Pope expected of his devotion and friendship. It was a simple and straight avowal that he had supposed he might take it upon himself to accord the dispensation. Then, as the sentence to be passed on such an error would be the business of Alexander, the accused could easily imagine beforehand how truly paternal such a sentence would be. Besides, the reward was in the same hands, as if the sentence was that of a father, the recompense would be that of a king. In fact, this recompense would be no less than the honor of assisting as envoy, with the title of cardinal, at the marriage of Lucrezia and Alfonso, a favor which would be very appropriate, since it would be thanks to his devotion that the marriage could take place. The Archbishop of Cosenza knew the men he was dealing with. He knew that to save their own ends they would hesitate at nothing. He knew they had a poison like sugar to the taste and to the smell impossible to discover in food, a poison that would kill slowly or quickly as the poisoner willed and would leave no trace behind. He knew the secret of the poison key that lay always on the Pope's mantelpiece, so that when His Holiness wished to destroy some one of his intimates, he bade him open a certain cupboard. On the handle of the key there was a little spike, and as the lock of the cupboard turned stiffly, the hand would naturally press, the lock would yield, and nothing would have come of it but a trifling scratch. The scratch was mortal. He knew, too, that Caesar wore a ring made like two lions' heads, and that he would turn the stone on the inside when he was shaking hands with a friend. Then the lion's teeth became the teeth of a viper, and the friend died cursing Borgia. So he yielded, partly through fear, partly blinded by the thought of the reward, and Caesar returned to the Vatican armed with the precious paper, in which the Archbishop of Cosenza admitted that he was the only person responsible for the dispensation granted to the royal nun. 2 days later, by means of the proofs scantily furnished by the Archbishop, the Pope, In the presence of the governor of Rome, the auditor of the apostolic chamber, the advocate, and the fiscal attorney pronounced sentence, condemning the archbishop to the loss of all his benefices and ecclesiastical offices, degradation from his orders, and confiscation of his goods. His person was to be handed over to the civil arm. 2 days later, the civil magistrate entered the prison to fulfill his office as received from the Pope, and appeared before the archbishop accompanied by the clerk, 2 servants, and 4 guards. The clerk unrolled the paper he carried and read out the sentence. The 2 servants untied a packet, and, stripping the prisoner of his ecclesiastical garments, they reclothed him in a dress of coarse, white cloth, which only reached down to his knees, breeches of the same, and a pair of clumsy shoes. Lastly, the guards took him and led him into one of the deepest dungeons of the castle of San Angelo, where, for furniture, he found nothing but a wooden crucifix, a table, a chair, and a bed. For occupation, a Bible and a breviary, with a lamp to read by. For nourishment, 2 pounds of bread and a little cask of water, which were to be renewed every 3 days, together with a bottle of oil for burning in his lamp. At the end of 1 year, the poor archbishop died of despair, not before he had known his own arms in his agony. The very same day that he was taken into the dungeon, Caesar Borgia, who had managed the affair so ably, was presented by the Pope with all the belongings of the condemned prisoner. But the hunting parties, balls, and masquerades were not the only pleasures enjoyed by the Pope and his family. From time to time, strange spectacles were exhibited. We will only describe 2, one of them a case of punishment, the other no more nor less than a matter of the stud farm. But as both of these give details with which we would not have our readers credit of our imagination, we will first say that they are literally translated from Burchard's Latin journal. About the same time, that is, about the beginning of 1499, a certain courtesan named La Corseta was in prison, and had a Lovell who came to visit her in woman's clothes, a Spanish Moor, called from his disguise the Spanish lady from Barbary. As a punishment, both of them were led through the town, the woman with a petticoat or a skirt, but wearing only the Moor's dress unbuttoned in front. The man wore his woman's garb, his hands were tied behind his back, and the skirt fastened up to his middle, with a view to complete exposure before the eyes of all. When in this attire they had made the circuit of the town, the Corseta was sent back to the prison with the Moor. But on the 7th of April, following, the Moor was again taken out, and escorted in the company of 2 thieves towards the Campo dei Fiori. 3 condemned men were then preceded by a constable, who rode backwards on an ass, and held in his hand a long pole, on the end of which were hung, still bleeding, the amputated limbs of a poor Jew, who had suffered torture and death for some trifling crime. When the procession reached the place of execution, the thieves were hanged, and the unfortunate Moor was tied to a stake piled round with wood, where he was to have been burnt to death, had not rain fallen in such torrents that the fire would not burn, in spite of all the efforts of the executioner. This unlooked-for accident, taken as a miracle by the people, robbed Lucrezia of the most exciting part of the execution. But her father was holding in reserve another kind of spectacle to console her with later. We inform the reader once more that the few lines we are about to set before him are a translation from the journal of the worthy German Burchard, who saw nothing in the bloodiest of most wanton performances but facts for his journal, which he duly registered with the impassibility of a scribe, appending no remark or moral reflection. On the 11th of November, a certain peasant was entering Rome with 2 stallions laden with wood, with the servants of His Holiness, just as he passed the piazza of St. Peter's, cut their girths, so that their loads fell on the ground with the pack saddles, and led off the horses to a court between the palace and the gate. Then the stable doors were opened, and 4 stallions, quite free and unbridled, rushed out, and in an instant all 6 animals began kicking, biting, and fighting each other until several were killed. Roderigo and Madame Lucrezia, who sat at the window just over the palace gate, took the greatest delight in the struggle, and called their courtiers to witness the gallant battle that was being fought below them. Now Caesar's trick in the matter of the Archbishop of Cosenza had the desired result, and Isabella and Ferdinand could no longer impute to Alexander the signature of the brief they had complained of. So nothing was now in the way of the marriage of Lucrezia and Alfonso. This certainly gave the Pope great joy, for he attached all the more importance to this marriage because he was already cogitating a second between Caesar and Doña Carlota, Frederick's daughter. Caesar had shown in all his actions since his brother's death his wonderful vocation for the ecclesiastical life, so no one was astonished when, a consistory having been summoned one morning by Alexander, Caesar entered, and addressing the Pope, began by saying that from his earliest years he had been drawn toward secular pursuits both by natural inclination and ability, and it had only been in obedience to the absolute commands of His Holiness that he entered the Church, accepted the Cardinal's scarlet, other dignities, and finally the sacred order of the diaconate, but feeling that in his situation it was improper to follow his passions, and at his age impossible to resist them, he humbly entreated His Holiness graciously to yield to the desire he had failed to overcome, and to permit him to lay aside the dress and dignities of the Church, and enter once more into the world, there to contract a lawful marriage. Also he entreated the Lord Cardinals to intercede for him with His Holiness, to whom he would freely resign all his churches, abbeys, and benefices, as well as every other ecclesiastical dignity and preferment that had been accorded him. The cardinals, deferring to Caesar's wishes, gave a unanimous vote, and the Pope, as we might suppose, like a good father, not wishing to force his son's inclinations, accepted his resignation and yielded to the petition. Thus Caesar put off the scarlet robe, which was suited to him, says his historian Tommaso Tommasi, in one particular only, that it was the color of blood. In truth, the resignation was a pressing necessity, and there was no time to lose. Charles VIII, one day after he had come home late and tired from the hunting field, had bathed his head in cold water, and going straight to table, had been struck down by an apoplectic seizure directly after his supper, and was dead, leaving the throne to the good Louis XII, a man of two conspicuous weaknesses, one as deplorable as the other. The first was the wish to make conquests. The second was the desire to have children. Alexander, who was on the watch for all political changes, had seen in a moment what he could get from Louis XII's accession to the throne, and was prepared to profit by the fact that the new king of France needed his help for the accomplishment of his twofold desire. Louis needed, first, his temporal aid in an expedition against the Duchy of Milan, on which, as we explained before, he had inherited claims from Valentina Visconti, his grandmother, and secondly, his spiritual aid to dissolve his marriage with Jeanne, the daughter of Louis XI, a childless and hideously deformed woman, who he had only married by reason of the great fear he entertained for her father. Now Alexander was willing to do all this for Louis XII, and to give in addition, a cardinal's hat to his friend George d'Amboise, provided only that the King of France would use his influence in persuading the young Doña Carlota, who was at his court, to marry his son Caesar. So, as this business was already far advanced on the day when Caesar doffed his scarlet and donned the secular garb, thus fulfilling the ambition so long cherished, when the Lord of Villeneuve, sent by Louis and commissioned to bring Caesar to France, presented himself before the ex-cardinal on his arrival at Rome, the latter, with his usual extravagance of luxury and the kindness he knew well how to bestow on those he needed, entertained his guest for a month, and did all the honours of Rome. After that they departed, preceded by one of the Pope's couriers, who gave orders that every town they passed through was to receive them with marks of honor and respect. The same order had been set throughout the whole of France, where the illustrious visitors received so numerous a guard, and were welcomed by a populace so eager to behold them, that after they passed through Paris, Caesar's gentlemen in waiting wrote to Rome that they had not seen any trees in France, or houses, or walls, but only men, women, and sunshine. The king, on the pretext of going out hunting, went to meet his guest 2 leagues outside the town. As he knew Caesar was very fond of the name of Valentine, which he had used as cardinal and still continued to employ with the title of count, although he had resigned the archbishop which gave him the name, he there and then bestowed on him the investiture of Valence in Dauphine with the title of duke and a pension of 20,000 francs. Then, when he had made this magnificent gift and talked with him for nearly a couple of hours, he took his leave to enable him to prepare the splendid entry he was proposing to make. It was Wednesday, the 18th of December, 1498, when Caesar Borgia entered the town of Chinon, with pomp worthy of the son of a pope who is about to marry the daughter of a king. The procession began with 24 mules, caparisoned in red, adorned with escutcheons bearing the duke's arms, laden with carved trunks and chests inlaid with ivory and silver. After them came 24 mares, also caparisoned, this time in the livery of the King of France, yellow and red. Next after this came 10 other mules, covered in yellow satin with red crossbars, and lastly another 10, covered with striped cloth of gold, the stripes alternatively raised in flat gold. Behind the 70 mules which led the procession, there pranced 16 handsome battle horses, led by equerries who marched alongside. These were followed by 18 hunters ridden by 18 pages, who were about 14 or 15 years of age. 16 of them were dressed in crimson velvet, and 2 in race gold cloth. So elegantly dressed were these 2 children, who were also the best looking of the little band, that the sight of them gave rise to strange suspicions as to the reasons for this preference, if one may believe what Brantome says. Finally, behind these 18 horses came 6 beautiful mules, all harnessed with red velvet, and led by 6 valets, also in velvet to match. The third group consisted of, first, 2 mules quite covered with cloth of gold, each carrying 2 chests, in which it was said that the Duke's treasure was stored, the precious stones he was bringing to his fiancée, and the relics and papal bulls that his father had cherished to convey from him to Louis XII. These were followed by 20 gentlemen dressed in cloth of gold and silver, among whom rode Paul Giordano Orsino, and several barons and knights among the chiefs of the estate ecclesiastic. Next came 2 drums, 1 rebec, and 4 soldiers blowing trumpets and silver clarions. Then, in the midst of a party of 24 lackeys, dressed half in crimson velvet and half in yellow silk, rode Messire Georges d'Amboise and Monseigneur the Duke of Valentinois. Caesar was mounted on a handsome tall courser, very richly harnessed, in a raw half-range satin and a half cloth of gold, embroidered all over with pearls and precious stones. In his cap were 2 rows of rubies the size of beans, which reflected so brilliant a light that one might have fancied they were the famous carbuncles of the Arabian Nights. He also wore on his neck a collar worth at least 200,000 livres. Indeed, there was no part of him, even down to his boots, that was not laced with gold and edged with pearls. His horse was covered with a cuirass and a pattern of golden foliage of wonderful workmanship, among which there appeared to glow, like flowers, nosegays of pearls and clusters of rubies. Lastly, bringing up the rear of the magnificent cortege, behind the Duke came 24 mules with red caparisons bearing his arms, carrying his silver plate, tents, and baggage. What gave to all the cavalcade an air of most wonderful luxury and extravagance was that the horses and mules were shod with golden shoes, and these were so badly nailed on that more than three-quarters of their number were lost on the road. For this extravagance Caesar was greatly blamed, for it was thought an audacious thing to put on his horse's feet a metal of which kings' crowns are made. But all this pomp had no effect on the lady for whose sake it had been displayed, for when Doña Carlota was told that Cesar Borgia had come to France in the hope of becoming her husband, she replied simply that she would never take a priest for her husband, and moreover the son of a priest, a man who was not only an assassin, but a fratricide, not only a man of infamous birth, but still more infamous in his morals and his actions. But, in default of the haughty Lady of Aragon, Caesar soon found another princess of noble blood who consented to be his wife. This was Mademoiselle d'Albret, daughter of the King of Navarre. The marriage, arranged on condition that the Pope should pay 200,000 ducats dowry to the bride, and should make her brother cardinal, was celebrated on the 10th of May, and on the Whitsunday following the Dukes of Valentinois received the Order of St. Michael, an order founded by Louis XI, and esteemed at this period as the highest in the gift of the kings of France. The news of this marriage, which made an alliance with Louis XII certain, was received with great joy by the Pope, who at once gave orders, fire bonfires, and illuminations all over the town. Louis XII was not only grateful to the Pope for dissolving his marriage with Jeanne of France and authorizing his union with Anne of Brittany, but he considered it indispensable to his designs in Italy to have the Pope as his ally. So he promised the Duke of Valentinois to put 300 lances at his disposal as soon as he had made an entry into Milan, to be used to further his own private interests, and against whomsoever he pleased except only the allies of France. The conquest of Milan should be undertaken so soon as Louis felt assured of the support of the Venetians, or at least of their neutrality, and he had sent them ambassadors authorized to promise in his name the restoration of Cremona and Guerra d'Ada when he had completed the conquest of Lombardy. End of section 16. Section 17 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Eves, Section 17. The Borgias, Chapter 9. Everything from without was favoring Alexander's encroaching policy when he was compelled to turn his eyes from France towards the center of Italy. In Florence dwelt a man, neither duke, nor king, nor soldier, a man whose power was in his genius, whose armor was his purity, who owed no offensive weapon but his tongue, and who yet began to grow more dangerous for him than all the kings, dukes, princes, and the whole world could ever be. This man was the poor Dominican monk Girolamo Savonarola, the same who had refused absolution to Lorenzo de' Medici because he would not restore the liberty of Florence. Girolamo Savonarola had prophesied the invasion of a force from beyond the Alps, and Charles VIII had conquered Naples. Girolamo Savonarola had prophesied that Charles VIII, that because he had failed to fulfill the mission of liberator entrusted to him by God, he was threatened with a great misfortune as a punishment, and Charles was dead. Lastly, Savonarola had prophesied his own fall, like the man who paced around the holy city for 8 days, crying, "Woe to Jerusalem!" and on the 9th day, "Woe be on my own head!" None the less, the Florentine reformer, who could not recoil from any danger, was determined to attack the colossal abomination that was seated on St. Peter's holy throne. each debauch, each fresh crime that lifted up its brazen face to the light of day, or tried to hide its shameful head beneath the veil of night, he had never failed to paint out to the people, denouncing it as the offspring of the Pope's luxurious living and lust of power. Thus had he stigmatized Alexandre's new amour with the beautiful Julia Farnese, who, in the preceding April, added another son to the Pope's family. Thus had he cursed the Duke of Gandia's murderer, the lustful, jealous fratricide. Lastly, he had pointed out to the Florentines, who were excluded from the league then forming, what sort of future was in store for them when the Borgias should have made themselves masters of small principalities and should come to attack the ducates and republics. It was clear that in Savonarola the Pope had an enemy at once, temporal and spiritual, whose importunate and threatening voice must be silenced at any cost. But mighty as the Pope's power was, to accomplish a design like this was no easy matter. Savonarola, preaching the stern principles of liberty, had united to his cause, even in the midst of rich, pleasure-loving Florence, a body of some size, known as the Piagnoni, or the Penitents. This band was composed of citizens who were anxious for reform in church and state, who accused the Medici of enslaving the fatherland and the Borgias of upsetting the faith, who demanded two things: that the republic should return to her democratic principles, and religion to a primitive simplicity. Towards the first of these projects considerable progress had been made, since they had successively obtained, first, an amnesty for all crimes and delinquencies committed under other governments; secondly, the abolition of the Balia, which was an aristocratic magistracy; thirdly, the establishment of a sovereign council composed of 1,800 citizens; and lastly, the substitution of popular elections for drawing by lot and for oligarchical nominations. These changes had been effected in spite of two other factions, the Arrabbiati, or madmen, who, consisting of the richest and noblest youths of the Florentine patrician families, desired to have an oligarchical government, and the Bigi, or Greys, so called because they always held their meetings in the shade, who desired the return of the Medici. The first measure Alexander used against the growing power of Savonarola was to declare him heretic, and as such banished from the pulpit. But Savonarola had eluded this prohibition by making his pupil and friend, Domenico Bombicini di Pescia, preach in his stead. The result was that the master's teachings were issued from other lips, and that was all. The seed, though scattered by another hand, fell none the less on fertile soil, where it would soon burst into flower. Moreover, Savonarola now set an example that was followed to good purpose by Luther, when 22 years later he burned Leo X's bolt of excommunication at Wittenberg. He was weary of silence, so he declared, on the authority of Pope Pelagius, that an unjust excommunication had no efficacy, and that the person excommunicated unjustly did not even need to get absolution. So, on Christmas Day, 1497, he declared that, by the inspiration of God, he renounced his obedience to a corrupt master, and he began to preach once more in the cathedral, with a success that was all the greater for the interruption, and an influence far more formidable than before, because it was strengthened by that sympathy of the masses which an unjust persecution always inspires. Then Alexander made overtures to Leonardo de' Medici, vicar of the Archbishopric of Florence, to obtain the punishment of the rebel Leonardo. In obedience to the orders he received from Rome, issued a mandate forbidding the faithful to attend at Savonarola's sermons. After this mandate, any who should hear the discourses of the excommunicated monk would be refused communion and confession, and as when they died they would be contaminated with heresy in consequence of their spiritual intercourse with a heretic, their dead bodies would be dragged on a hurdle and deprived of the rites of sepulture. Savonarola appealed from the mandate of his superior both to the people and to the Signoria, and the two together gave orders to the episcopal vicar to leave Florence within 2 hours. This happened at the beginning of the year 1498. The expulsion of Leonard de' Medici was a new triumph for Savonarola, so, wishing to turn to good moral account his growing influence, he resolved to convert the last day of the carnival, hitherto given up to worldly pleasures, into a day of religious sacrifice. So actually, on Shrub Tuesday, a considerable number of boys were collected in front of the cathedral, and there divided into bands, which traversed the whole town, making a house-to-house visitation, claiming all profane books, licentious paintings, lutes, harps, cards and dice, cosmetics and perfumes. In a word, all the hundreds of products of a corrupt society and civilization, by the aid of which Satan at times makes victorious war on God. The inhabitants of Florence obeyed, and came forth to the piazza of the Duomo, bringing these works of perdition, which were soon piled up in a huge sack, which the youthful reformers set on fire, singing religious psalms and hymns the while. On this pile were burned many copies of Boccaccio and of Morgante Maggiore, and pictures of Fra Bartolomeo, who from that day forward renounced the art of this world, to consecrate his brush utterly and entirely to the reproduction of religious scenes. A reform such as this was terrifying to Alexandre, so he resolved on fighting Savonarola with his own weapons, that is, by the force of eloquence. He chose as the Dominican's opponent a preacher of recognized talent called Fra Francesco di Paggia, and he sent him to Florence, where he began to preach in Santa Croce, accusing Savonarola of heresy and impiety. At the same time, the Pope, in a new brief, announced that to the Signoria that unless they forbade the arch-heretic to preach, all the goods of Florentine merchants who lived on the papal territory would be confiscated, and the Republic laid on an interdict and declared the spiritual and temporal enemy of the Church. The Signoria, abandoned by France, and aware that the material power of Rome was increasing in a frightful manner, was forced to this time to yield, and to issue to Savonarola an order to leave off preaching. He obeyed, and bade farewell to his congregation in a sermon full of strength and eloquence. But the withdrawal of Savonarola, so far from calming the ferment, had increased it. There was talk about his prophecies being fulfilled, and some zealots, more ardent than their mastery, added miracle to inspiration, and loudly proclaimed that Savonarola had offered to go down into the vaults of the cathedral with his antagonist, and there bring a dead man to life again, to prove that his doctrine was true, promising to declare himself vanquished if the miracle were performed by his adversary. These rumors reached the ears of Fra Francesco, and as he was a man of warm blood, who counted his own life as nothing if it might be spent to help his cause, he declared in all humility that he felt he was too great a sinner for God to work a miracle in his behalf. But he proposed another challenge. He would try with Savonarola the ordeal of fire. He knew, he said, that he must perish, but at least he should perish avenging the cause of religion, since he was certain to involve in his destruction the tempter who plunged so many souls, beside his own, into eternal damnation. The proposition made by Fra Francesco was taken to Savonarola, but as he had never proposed the earlier challenge, he hesitated to accept the second. Hereupon his disciple, Fra Domenico Bonvicini, more confident than his master in his own power, declared himself ready to accept the trial by fire in his stead. So certain was he that God would perform a miracle by the intercession of Savonarola, his prophet. Instantly the report spread through Florence that the mortal challenge was accepted. Savonarola's partisans, all men of the strongest convictions, felt no doubt as to the success of their cause. His enemies were enchanted at the thought of the heretic giving himself to the flames, and the indifferent saw in the ordeal a spectacle of real and terrible interest. But the devotion of Fra Bonvicini of Pescia was not what Fra Francesco was reckoning with. He was willing, no doubt, to die a terrible death, but on condition that Savonarola died with him. What mattered to him the death of an obscure disciple like Fra Bonvicini? It was the master he would strike, the great teacher who must be involved in his own ruin. So he refused to enter the fire except with Savonarola himself, and, playing this terrible game in his own person, would not allow his adversary to play it by proxy. Then a thing happened which certainly no one could have anticipated. In the place of Fra Francesco, who would not tilt with any but the master, two Franciscan monks appeared to tilt with the disciple. These were Fra Nicolas de Pili and Fra Andrea Rondinelli. Immediately the partisans of Savonarola, seeing this arrival of reinforcements for their antagonist, came forward in a crowd to try the ordeal. The Franciscans were unwilling to be behindhand, and everybody took sides with equal ardor for one or another party. All Florence was like a den of madmen. Everyone wanted the ordeal. Everyone wanted to go into the fire. Not only did men challenge one another, but women and even children were clamoring to allow the try. At last the Signoria, reserving this privilege for the first applicants, ordered that the strange duel should take place only between Fra Domenico Bombincini and Fra Andrea Rondinelli. 10 of the citizens were to arrange all the details. The date fixed for the 7th of April, 1498, and the place the Piazza del Palazzo. The judges of the field made their arguments conscientiously. By their orders a scaffolding was erected at the appointed place, 5 feet in height, 10 in width, and 8 feet long. This scaffolding was covered with faggots and heat, supported by crossbars of the very driest wood that could be found. 2 narrow paths were made, 2 feet wide at most, their entrance given, and the Loggia dei Lanzi, their exit exactly opposite. The loggia was itself divided into 2 by a partition, so that each champion had a kind of room to make his preparations in, just as in the theatre every actor has his dressing room. But in this instance the tragedy was about to be played was not a fictitious one. The Franciscans arrived in the piazza and entered the compartment reserved for them without making any religious demonstration, while Savonarola, on the contrary, advanced to his own place in the procession, wearing the sacerdotal robes in which he had just celebrated the Holy Eucharist, and holding in his hand the sacred host for all the world to see, as it was enclosed in a crystal tabernacle. Fra Domenico di Peccia, the hero of the occasion, followed, bearing a crucifix, and all the Dominican monks, their red crosses in their hands, marched behind, singing a psalm. While behind them again followed the most considerable of the citizens of their party, bearing torches, for sure as they were the triumph of their cause, they wished to fire the faggots themselves. The piazza was so crowded that the people overflowed into all the streets around. In every door and window there was nothing to be seen but heads ranged one above the other. The terraces were covered with people, and curious spectators were observed at the roof of the Duomo and on the top of the Campanile. But, brought face to face with the ordeal, the Franciscans raised such difficulties that it was very plain the heart of their champion was failing him. The first fear they expressed was that Fra Bombincini was an enchanter, and so carried about him some talisman or charm which would save him from the fire. So they insisted that he should be stripped of all his clothes and put on others to be inspected by witnesses. Fra Bombincini made no objection, though the suspicion was humiliating. He changed shirt, dress, and cowl. Then, when the Franciscans observed that Savonarola was placing the tabernacle in his hands, they protested that it was profanation to expose the sacred host to the risk of burning, that this was not in the bond, and if Bombincini would not give up his supernatural aid, they for their part would give up the trial altogether. Savonarola replied that this was not astonishing that the champion of religion who put his faith in God should bear in his hands that very God to whom he entrusted his salvation. But this reply did not satisfy the Franciscans, who were unwilling to let go of their contention. Savonarola remained inflexible, supporting his own right, and thus nearly 4 hours passed in the discussion of points which neither party would give up, and affairs remained in statu quo. Meanwhile, the people, jammed together in the streets, on the terraces, on the roofs, since break of day, were suffering from hunger and thirst and beginning to get impatient. Their impatience soon developed into loud murmurs, which reached even the champion's ears, so that the partisans of Savonarola, who felt such faith in him that they were confident of a miracle, entreated him to yield to all the conditions suggested. To this Savonarola replied that if it were himself making the trial, he would be less inexorable, but since another man was incurring the danger, he could not take too many precautions. 2 more hours passed, while his partisans tried in vain to combat his refusals. At last, as night was coming on, and the people grew even more and more impatient, and their murmurs began to assume a threatening tone, Bombincini declared that he was ready to walk through the fire, holding nothing in his hands but a crucifix. No one could refuse him this, so Fra Rondinelli was compelled to accept his proposition. The announcement was made to the populace that the champions had come to terms, and the trial was about to take place. At this news the people calmed down, in the hope of being compensated at last for their long wait. But at that very moment a storm, which had long been threatening, broke over Florence with such fury that the faggots which had just been lighted were extinguished by the rain, leaving no possibility of their rekindling. From the moment when the people suspected that they had been fooled, their enthusiasm was changed into derision. They were ignorant from which side the difficulties had arisen that had hindered the trial, so they laid the responsibility on both champions without distinction. The Signoria, foreseeing the disorder that was now imminent, ordered the assembly to retire, but the assembly thought otherwise and stayed on the piazza, waiting for the departure of the 2 champions, in spite of the fearful rain that still fell in torrents. Rondinelli was taken back amid shouts and hootings, and pursued with showers of stones. Savonarola, thanks to his sacred garments and the host which he still carried, passed calmly enough through the midst of the mob, a miracle quite as remarkable as if he had passed through the fire unscathed. But it was only the sacred majesty of the host that protected this man, who was indeed from this moment regarded as a false prophet. The crowd allowed Savonarola to return to his convent, but they regretted the necessity, so excited were they by the Arrabbiati party, who had always denounced him as a liar and a hypocrite. So when the next morning, Palm Sunday, he stood up in the pulpit to explain his conduct, he could not obtain a moment's silence from insults, hooting, and loud laughter. Then the outcry, at first derisive, became menacing. Savonarola, whose voice was too weak to subdue the tumult, descended from his pulpit, retired into the sacristy, and thence to his convent, where he shut himself up in his cell. At that moment a cry was heard, and was repeated to everybody present. "To San Marco! To San Marco!" The rioters, few at first, were recruited by all the populace as they swept along the streets, and at last reached the convent, dashing like an angry sea against the wall. The doors, closed on Savonarola's entrance, soon crashed before the vehement onset of the powerful multitude, which struck down on the instant every obstacle it met. The whole convent was quickly flooded with people, and Savonarola, with 2 of his confederates, Domenico Bombincini and Silvestro Maruffi, was arrested in his cell and conducted to prison amid the insults of the crowd, who, always in extremes, whether of enthusiasm or hatred, would have liked to tear them to pieces, and would not be quieted till they had exacted a promise that the prisoners should be forcibly compelled to make the trial of fire which they have refused to make of their own free will. Alexander VI, as we may suppose, had not been without influence in bringing about this sudden and astonishing reaction, although he was not present in person, and had scarcely learned the news of Savonarola's fall and arrest when he claimed him as subject to ecclesiastical jurisdiction. But in spite of the grant of indulgences wherewith this demand was accompanied, the Signoria insisted that Savonarola's trial should take place at Florence, adding a request so as to not appear to withdraw the accused completely from the pontifical authority, that the Pope would send 2 ecclesiastical judges to sit in the Florentine tribunal. Alexander, seeing that he would get nothing better from the magnificent republic, sent as deputies Gioacchino Turriano Benic, general of the Dominicans, and Francesco Ramolini, doctor in law. They practically brought the sentence with them, declaring Savonarola and his accomplices heretics, schismatics, persecutors of the church, and seducers of the people. The firmness shown by the Florentines in claiming the rights of jurisdiction were nothing but an empty show to save appearances. The tribunal, as a fact, was composed of 8 members, all known to be fervent haters of Savonarola, whose trial began with the torture. The result was that, feeble in body, constitutionally nervous and irritable, he had not been able to endure the rack, and, overcome by agony, just at the moment when the executioner had lifted him up by the wrists and then dropped him at a distance of 2 feet to the ground, he had confessed, in order to get some respite, that his prophecies were nothing more than conjectures. If it is true that so soon as he went back to prison he protested against the confession, saying that it was the weakness of his bodily organs and his wanton firmness that had wrested the life from him, but that the truth really was that the Lord had several times appeared to him in his ecstasies and revealed the things that he had spoken. This protestation led to a new application of the torture, during which Savonarola succumbed once more to the dreadful pain, and once more retracted. But scarcely was he unbound, and was still lying on the bed of torture, when he declared that his confessions were the fault of his tortures, and the vengeance would recoil upon their heads. And he protested yet once more against all he had confessed and might confess again. A third time the torture produced the same avowals, and the relief that followed it the same retractions. The judges, therefore, when they condemned him and his 2 disciples to the flames, decided that his confession should not be read aloud at the stake, according to custom, feeling certain that in this occasion also he would give it the lie, and that publicly, which, as anyone must see who knew the versatile spirit of the public, would be a most dangerous proceeding. On the 23rd of May, the fire which had been promised to the people before was a second time prepared on the Piazza del Palazzo, and this time the crowd assembled quite certain that they would not be disappointed of a spectacle so long anticipated. And towards 11 o'clock in the morning, Girolamo Savonarola, Domenico Bombicini, and Silvestro Maruffi were led to the place of execution, the greater of their orders by the ecclesiastical judges, and bound all 3 to the same stake in the centre of an immense pile of wood. Then the bishop Pagnanoli told the condemned men that he cut them off from the church. "I, from the church militant," said Savonarola, who from that very hour, thanks to his martyrdom, was entering into the church triumphant. No other words were spoken by the condemned men, for at this moment one of the Arrabbiati, a personal enemy of Savonarola, breaking through the hedge of guards around the scaffold, snatched the torch from the executioner's hand and himself set fire to the 4 corners of the pile. Savonarola and his disciples, from the moment when they saw the smoke arise, began to sing a psalm, and the flames enwrapped them on all sides with a glowing bile, and the religious song was yet heard mounting upward to the gates of heaven. Pope Alexander VI was thus set free from perhaps the most formidable enemy who had ever risen against them, and the pontifical vengeance pursued the victims even after their death. The Signoria, yielding to his wishes, gave orders that the ashes of the prophet and his disciples should be thrown into the Arno. But certain half-burned fragments were picked up by the very soldiers whose business it was to keep the people back from approaching the fire, and the holy relics are even now shown, blackened by the flames, to the faithful, who, if they no longer regard Savonarola as a prophet, revere him none the less as a martyr. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Vermalium. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 18. The Borgias. Chapter 10, Part 1. The French army was now preparing to cross the Alps a second time under the command of Trivulus. Louis XII. had come as far as Lyons in the company of Cesar Borgia and Giuliano della Rovere, in whom he had forced a reconciliation, and towards the beginning of the month of May had sent his vanguard before him, soon to be followed by the main body of the army. The forces he was employing in this second campaign of conquest were 1,600 lances, 5,000 Swiss, 9,000 Gascons, and 3,500 infantry, raised from all parts of France. On the 13th of August, this whole body, amounting to nearly 15,000 men, who were to combine their forces with the Venetians, arrived beneath the walls of Arezzo, and immediately laid siege to the town. Ludovico Sforza's position was a terrible one. He was now suffering from his imprudence in calling the French into Italy. All the allies he had thought he might count upon were abandoning him at the same moment, either because they were busy about their own affairs, or because they were afraid of the powerful enemy that the Duke of Milan had made for himself. Maximilian, who had promised him a contribution of 400 lances to make up for not renewing the hostilities with Louis XII. That had been interrupted, had just made a league with the circle of Swabia to war against the Swiss, whom he had declared rebels against the empire. The Florentines, who had engaged to furnish him with 300 men-at-arms and 2,000 infantry if he would help them to retake Pisa, had just retracted their promise because of Louis XII's threats, and had undertaken to remain neutral. Frederick, who was holding back his troops for the defence of his own states, because he supposed, not without reason, that, Milan once conquered, he would again have to defend Naples, sent him no help, no men, no money, in spite of his promises. Ludovico Sforza was therefore reduced to his own proper forces. But as he was a man powerful in arms and clever in artifice, he did not allow himself to succumb at the first blow, and in all haste fortified Annona, Novaro, and Alessandria, sent off Cajazzo with troops to that part of the Milanese territory which borders on the States of Venice, and collected on the Po as many troops as he could. But these precautions availed him nothing against the impetuous onslaught of the French, who in a few days had taken Annona, Arezzo, Novaro, Voghera, Castelnuovo, Pontecorona, Tartone, and Alessandria, while Trivulus was on the march to Milan. Seeing the rapidity of this conquest and their numerous victories, Ludovico Sforza, despairing of holding out in his capital, resolved to retire to Germany with his children, his brother, Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, and his treasure, which had been reduced in the course of 8 years from 1.5 million to 200 ducats. But before he went, he left Bernardino da Carte in charge of the castle of Milan. In vain did his friends warn him to distrust this man. In vain did his brother Ascanio offer to hold the fortress himself, and offer to hold it to the very last. Ludovico refused to make any change in his arrangements, and started on the 2nd of September, leaving in the citadel 3,000 foot and enough provisions, ammunition, and money to sustain a siege of several months. 2 days after Ludovico's departure, the French entered Milan. 10 days later, Bernardino da Carte gave up the castle before a single gun had been fired. 21 days had sufficed for the French to get possession of the various towns, the capital, and all the territories of their enemy. Louis XII. received the news of this success while he was at Lyons, and he at once started for Milan, where he was received with demonstrations of joy that were really sincere. Citizens of every rank had come out 3 miles distant from the gates to receive him, and 40 boys, dressed in cloth of gold and silk, marched before him, singing hymns of victory, composed by poets of the period, in which the king was styled the liberator and the envoy of freedom. The great joy of the Milanese people was due to the fact that friends of Louis had been spreading reports beforehand that the King of France was rich enough to abolish all taxes, and so soon as the second day from his arrival at Milan, the conqueror made some slight reduction, granted important favours to certain Milanese gentlemen, and bestowed the town of Vigavano on Trivulus as a reward for his swift and glorious campaign. But Cesare Borgia, who had followed Louis XII. With a view to playing his part in the great hunting ground of Italy, scarcely waited for him to attain his end when he claimed the fulfilment of his promise, which the king with his accustomed loyalty hastened to perform. He instantly put at the disposal of Cesare 300 lances under the command of Yves d'Allegre, and 4,000 Swiss under the command of the bailiff of Dijon, as a help in his work of reducing the vicars of the church. We must now explain to our readers who these new personages were whom we introduce upon the scene by the above name. During the eternal wars of Guelphs and Ghibellines and the long exile of the popes at Avignon, most of the towns and fortresses of the Romagna had been usurped by petty tyrants, who, for the most part, hard received from the empire the investiture of their new possessions. But ever since German influence had retired beyond the Alps, and the popes had again made Rome the centre of the Christian world, all the small princes, robbed of their original protector, had rallied round the papal see, and received at the hands of the pope a new investiture, and now they paid annual dues, for which they received the particular title of duke, count, or lord, and the general name of vicar of the church. It had been no difficult matter for Alexandre, scrupulously examining the actions and behaviour of these gentlemen during the 7 years that had elapsed since he was exalted to St. Peter's throne, to find in the conduct of each one of them something that could be called an infraction of the treaty between vassals and suzerain. Accordingly, he brought forward his complaints at a tribunal established for the purpose, and obtained sentence from the judges to the effect that the vicars of the church, having failed to fulfil the conditions of their investiture, were despoiled of their domains, which would again become the property of the Holy See. As the Pope was now dealing with men against whom it was easier to pass a sentence than to get it carried out, he had nominated as Captain General the new Duke of Valentinois, who was commissioned to recover the territories for his own benefit. The lords in question were the Malatesti of Rimini, the Sforza of Pesaro, the Manfredi of Faenza, the Riari of Imola and Farli, the Variani of Camerina, the Montefeltri of Urbino, and the Gaetani of Sermoneta. But the Duke of Valentinois, eager to keep as warm as possible his great friendship with his ally and relative Louis XII., was, as we know, staying with him at Milan so long as he remained there, where, after a month's occupation, the king retraced his steps to his own capital. The Duke of Valentinois ordered his men-at-arms and his Swiss to await him between Parma and Modena, and departed post-haste for Rome, to explain his plans to his father viva voce, and to receive his final instructions. When he arrived, he found that the fortune of his sister Lucrezia had been greatly augmented in his absence, not from the side of her husband Alfonso, whose future was very uncertain now in consequence of Louis's successes, which had caused some coolness between Alfonso and the Pope, but from her father's side, upon whom at this time she exercised an influence more astonishing than ever. The Pope had declared Lucrezia Borgia of Aragon life governor of Spoleto and its duchy, with all emoluments, rights, and revenues accruing thereunto. This had so greatly increased her power and improved her position, that in these days she never showed herself in public without a company of 200 horses, ridden by the most illustrious ladies and noblest knights of Rome. Moreover, as a twofold affection of her father was a secret to nobody, the first prelates in the church, the frequenters of the Vatican, the friends of his Holiness, were all her most humble servants. Cardinals gave her their hands when she stepped from her litter or her horse. Archbishop disputed the honour of celebrating Mass in her private apartments. But Lucrezia had been obliged to quit Rome in order to take possession of her new estates, and as her father could not spend much time away from his beloved daughter, he resolved to take into his hands the town of Nepi, which on a former occasion, as the reader will doubtless remember, he had bestowed on Ascanio Sforza in exchange for his suffrage. Ascanio had naturally lost this town when he attached himself to the fortunes of the Duke of Milan, his brother, and when the Pope was about to take it again, he invited his daughter Lucrezia to join him there and be present at the rejoicings held in honour of his resuming its possession. Lucrezia's readiness in giving way to her father's wishes brought her a new gift from him. This was a town and territory of Sermoneta, which belonged to the Gaetani. Of course the gift was yet a secret, because the two owners of the seigneury had first to be disposed of, one being Monsignore Giacomo Gaetano, apostolic pronotary, the other Prospero Gaetano, a young cavalier of great promise, but as both lived at Rome, and entertained no suspicion, but indeed supposed themselves to be in high favour with his Holiness, the one by virtue of his position, the other of his courage, the matter seemed to present no great difficulty. So, directly after the return of Alexander to Rome, Giacomo Gaetano was arrested, on what pretext we know not, was taken to the castle of Sant'Angelo, and there died shortly after of poison. Prospero Gaetano was strangled in his own house. After these two deaths, which both occurred so suddenly as to give no time for either to make a will, the people declared that Sermoneta and all of her property appertaining to the Gaetani devolved upon the apostolic chamber, and they were sold to Lucrezia for the sum of 80,000 crowns, which her father refunded to her the day after. Though Cæsar hurried to Rome, he found when he arrived that his father had been beforehand with him and had made the beginning of his conquests. Another fortune also had been making prodigious strides during Cæsar's stay in France, viz. the fortune of John Borgia, the Pope's nephew, who had been one of the most devoted friends of the Duke of Gandia up to the time of his death. It was said in Rome, and not in a whisper, that the young cardinal owed the favours heaped upon him by his Holiness less to the memory of the brother than to the protection of the sister. Both these reasons made John Borgia a special object of suspicion to Cæsar, and it was with an inward vow that he should not enjoy his new dignities very long that the Duke of Valentinois heard that his cousin John had just been nominated Cardinal Alatere of all the Christian world, and had quitted Rome to make a circuit through all the pontifical states with a suite of archbishops, bishops, prelates, and gentlemen, such as would have done honour to the Pope himself. Cæsar had only come to Rome to get news, so he only stayed 3 days, and then, with all the troops his Holiness could supply, rejoined his forces on the borders of the Udza, and marched at once to Imola. This town, abandoned by its chiefs, who had retired to Forli, was forced to capitulate. Imola taken, Cesar marched straight upon Forli. There he met with a serious check, a check, moreover, which came from a woman, Caterina Sforza, widow of Girolamo and mother of Ottaviano Riario, had retired to this town and stirred up the courage of the garrison by putting herself, her goods, and her person under their protection. Cesar saw that it was no longer a question of a sudden capture, but of a regular siege, so he began to make all his arrangements with a view to it, and placing a battery of cannon in front of the place where the walls seemed to him weakest, he ordered an uninterrupted fire to be continued until the breach was practicable. When he returned to the camp after giving this order, he found there John Borgia, who had gone to Rome from Ferrara, and was unwilling to be so near Cesar without paying him a visit. He was received with effusion and apparently the greatest joy, and stayed 3 days. On the 4th day all the officers and members of the court were invited to a grand farewell supper, and Cesar bade farewell to his cousin, charging him with dispatches for the Pope, and lavishing upon him all the tokens of affection he had shown on his arrival. Cardinal John Borgia posted off as soon as he left the supper-table, but on arriving at Urbino he was seized with such a sudden and strange indisposition that he was forced to stop. But after a few minutes, feeling rather better, he went on. Scarcely, however, had he entered Rocca Contrara, when he again felt so extremely ill that he resolved to go no farther, and stayed a couple of days in the town. And then, as he thought he was a little better again, and as he had heard the news of the taking of Forli, and also that Caterina Sforza had been taken prisoner while she was making an attempt to retire into the castle, he resolved to go back to Cesar and congratulate him on his victory. But at Fossambrane he was forced to stop a 3rd time, although he had given up his carriage for a litter. This was his last halt. The same day he sought his bed, never to rise from it again. 3 days later he was dead. His body was taken to Rome and buried without any ceremony in the church of Santa Maria del Popolo, where lay awaiting him the corpse of his friend, the Duke of Gandia, and there was now no more talk of the young cardinal, high as his rank had been, than if he had never existed. Thus in gloom and silence passed away all those who were swept to destruction by the ambition of that terrible trio, Alexander, Lucrezia, and Cesar. End of section 18. Section 19 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shaliva Malyam. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1, by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 19. The Borgias. Chapter 10, Part 2. Almost at the same time, Rome was terrified by another murder. Don Giovanni Cerviglione, a gentleman by birth and a brave soldier, captain of the Pope's men-at-arms, was attacked one evening by the sbirri, as he was on his way home from supping with Don Alicio Pignatelli. One of the men asked his name, and as he pronounced it, seeing that there was no mistake, plunged a dagger into his breast, while a second man with the back-stroke of his sword cut off his head, which lay actually at his feet before his body had time to fall. The governor of Rome lodged a complaint against this assassination with the Pope, but quickly perceiving by the way his intimation was received that he would have done better to say nothing, he stopped the inquiries he had started, so that neither of the murderers was ever arrested. But the rumour was circulated that Cesar, in the short stay he had made at Rome, had had a rendezvous with Cerviglione's wife, who was a Borgia by birth, and that her husband, when he heard of this infringement of conjugal duty, had been angry enough to threaten her and her lover too. The threat had reached Cesar's ears, who, making a long arm of Michelotto, had himself at Forli struck down Cerviglione in the street of Rome. Another unexpected death followed so quickly on that of Don Giovanni Cerviglione that it could not but be attributed to the same originator, if not the same cause. Monsignore Agnelli of Mantua, Archbishop of Cosenza, clerk of the chamber and vice-legate of Viterbo, having fallen into disgrace with his Holiness, how it is not known, was poisoned at his own table, at which he had passed a good part of the night in cheerful conversation with 3 or 4 guests, the poison gliding meanwhile through his veins. Then, going to bed in perfect health, he was found dead in the morning. His possessions were at once divided into 3 portions. The land and houses were given to the Duke of Valentinois, the bishopric went to Francesco Borgia, son of Calixtus III, and the office of clerk of the chamber was sold for 5,000 ducats to Ventura Bonassai, a merchant of Siena, who produced this sum for Alexandre, and settled down the very same day in the Vatican. This last death served the purpose of determining a point of law hitherto uncertain. As Monsignore Agnelli's natural heirs had made some difficulty about being disinherited, Alexandre issued a brief, whereby he took from every cardinal and every priest the right of making a will, and declared that all their property should henceforth devolve upon him. But Cesar was stopped short in the midst of his victories. Thanks to the 200,000 ducats that yet remained in his treasury, Ludovico Sforza had levied 500 men-at-arms from Burgundy and 8,000 Swiss infantry, with whom he had entered Lombardy. So Trivulz, to face this enemy, had been compelled to call back Yves d'Allegre and the troops that Louis XII had lent to Cesar. Consequently, Cesar, leaving behind a body of pontifical soldiery as garrison at Forli and Imola, betook himself with the rest of his force to Rome. It was Alexander's wish that his entry should be a triumph, so when he learned that the quartermasters of the army were only a few leagues from the town, he sent out runners to invite the royal ambassadors, the cardinals, the prelates, the Roman barons and municipal dignitaries to make procession with all their suite to meet the Duke of Valentinois, and, as it always happens, that the pride of those who command is surpassed by the baseness of those who obey, the orders were not only fulfilled to the letter, but beyond it. The entry of Cesar took place on the 26th of February, 1500. Although this was the great Jubilee year, the festivals of the Carnival began none the less for that, and were conducted in a manner even more extravagant and licentious than usual, and the conqueror, after the first day, prepared a new display of ostentation, which he concealed under the veil of a masquerade. As he was pleased to identify himself with the glory, genius, and fortune of the great man whose name he bore, he resolved on a representation of the triumph of Julius Caesar, to be given on the Piazza di Navona, the ordinary place for holding the carnival fete. The next day, therefore, he and his retinue started from that square, and traversed all the streets of Rome, wearing classical costumes and riding in antique cars, on one of which Cesar stood, clad in the robe of an emperor of old, his brow crowned with a golden laurel wreath, surrounded by lictors, soldiers, and ensign-bearers, who carried banners whereon was inscribed the motto, Aut Caesar, aut nihil. Finally, on the 4th Sunday in Lent, the Pope conferred upon Cesar the dignity he had so long coveted, and appointed him general and gonfaloniere of the Holy Church. In the meanwhile Sforza had crossed the Alps and passed the Lake of Como, amid acclamations of joy from his former subjects, who had quickly lost the enthusiasm that the French army and Louis's promises had inspired. These demonstrations were so noisy at Milan that Tréville, judging that there was no safety for a French garrison in remaining there, made his way to Novara. Experience proved that he was not deceived, for scarcely had the Milanese observed his preparation for departure, when a suppressed excitement began to spread through the town, and soon the streets were filled with armed men. This murmuring crowd had to be passed through, sword in hand and lance in rest, and scarcely had the French got outside the gates when the mob rushed out after the army into the country, pursuing them with shouts and hooting as far as the banks of the Ticino. Tréville left 400 lances at Novara, as well as 3,000 Swiss that Yves d'Allegre had brought from the Romagna, and directed his course with the rest of the army towards Mortara, where he stopped at last to await the help he had demanded from the King of France. Behind him Cardinal Ascanio and Ludovico entered Milan amid the acclamations of the whole town. Neither of them lost any time, and wishing to profit by this enthusiasm, Ascanio undertook to besiege the castle of Milan, while Ludovico should cross the Ticino and attack Novara. The besiegers and besieged were sons of the same nation, for Yves d'Allegre had scarcely as many as 300 French with him, and Ludovico 500 Italians. In fact, for the last 16 years, the Swiss had been practically the only infantry in Europe, and all the powers came, purse in hand, to draw from the mighty reservoir of their mountains. The consequence was that these rude children of William Tell, put up to auction by the nations, and carried away from the humble hardy life of a mountain people into cities of wealth and pleasure, had lost, not their ancient courage, but that rigidity of principle for which they had been distinguished before their intercourse with other nations. From being models of honor and good faith, they had become a kind of marketable ware, always ready for sale to the highest bidder. The French were the first to experience this venality, which later on proved so fatal to Ludovico Sforza. Now the Swiss in the garrison at Novara had been in communication with their compatriots in the vanguard of the ducal army, and when they found that they, who as a fact were unaware that Ludovico's treasure was nearly exhausted, were better fed as well as better paid than themselves, they offered to give up the town and go over to the Milanese if they could be certain of the same pay. Ludovico, as we may well suppose, closed with this bargain. The whole of Novara was given up to him except the citadel, which was defended by Frenchmen. Thus the enemy's army was recruited by 3,000 men. Then Ludovico made the mistake of stopping to besiege the castle instead of marching on to Mortara with a new reinforcement. The result of this was that Louis XII, to whom runners had been sent by Tréville, understanding his perilous position, hastened the departure of the French gendarmerie, who were already collected to cross into Italy, sent off the bailiff of Dijon to levy new Swiss forces, and ordered Cardinal Ambroise, his prime minister, to cross the Alps and take up a position at Asti, to hurry on the work of collecting the troops. There the cardinal found a nest egg of 3,000 men. La Trémouille added 1,500 lances and 6,000 French infantry. Finally, the bailiff of Dijon arrived with 10,000 Swiss, so that, counting the troops which Tréville had at Mortara, Louis XII found himself master on the other side of the Alps of the first army any French king had ever led out to battle. Soon, by good marching, and before Ludovico knew the strength of or even the existence of this army, it took up a position between Novara and Milan, cutting off all communication between the duke and his capital. He was therefore compelled, in spite of his inferior numbers, to prepare for a pitched battle. But it so happened that just when the preparations for a decisive engagement were being made on both sides, the Swiss Diet, learning that the sons of Helvetia were on the point of cutting one another's throats, sent orders to all the Swiss serving in either army to break their engagements and return to the fatherland. But during the 2 months that had passed between the surrender of Novara and the arrival of the French army before the town, there had been a very great change in the face of things, because Ludovico Sforza's treasure was now exhausted. New confabulations had gone on between the outposts, and this time, thanks to the money sent by Louis XII, it was the Swiss in the service of France who were found to be the better fed and the better paid. The worthy Helvetians, since they no longer fought for their own liberty, knew the value of their blood too well to allow a single drop of it to be spilt for less than its weight in gold. The result was, that as they had betrayed Yves d'Allegre, they resolved to betray Ludovico Sforza too, and while the recruits brought in by the bailiff of Dijon were standing firmly by the French flag, careless of the order of the Diet, Ludovico's auxiliaries declared that in fighting against their Swiss brethren, they would be acting in disobedience to the Diet, and would risk capital punishment in the end, a danger that nothing would induce them to incur unless they immediately received the arrears of their pay. The Duke, who had spent the last ducat he had with him, and was entirely cut off from his capital, knew that he could not get money till he had fought his way through to it, and therefore invited the Swiss to make one last effort, promising them not only the pay that was in arrears, but a double hire. But unluckily the fulfilment of this promise was dependent on the doubtful issue of a battle, and the Swiss replied that they had far too much respect for their country to disobey its decree, and that they loved their brothers far too well to consent to shed their blood without reward, and therefore Sforza would do well not to count upon them, since indeed the very next day they proposed to return to their homes. The Duke then saw that all was lost, but he made a last appeal to their honour, adjuring them at least to ensure his personal safety by making it a condition of capitulation. But they replied that even if a condition of such a kind would not make capitulation impossible, it would certainly deprive them of advantages which they had a right to expect, and on which they counted as indemnification for the arrears of their pay. They pretended, however, at last that they were touched by the prayers of the man whose orders they had obeyed so long, and offered to conceal him, dressed in their clothes, among their ranks. This proposition was barely plausible, for Sforza was short, and by this time an old man, and he could not possibly escape recognition in the midst of an army where the oldest was not past 30, and the shortest not less than 5'6". Still, this was his last chance, and he did not reject it at once, but tried to modify it, so that it might help him in his trades. His plan was to disguise himself as a Franciscan monk, so that mounted on a shabby horse he might pass for their chaplain. The others, Galeazzo di San Severino, who commanded under him, and his 2 brothers, were all tall men, so, adopting the dress of common soldiers, they hoped they might escape detection in the Swiss ranks. Scarcely were these plans settled, when the Duke heard that the capitulation was signed between Trivulzio and the Swiss, who had made no stipulation in favour of him and his generals. They were to go over the next day with arms and baggage right into the French army, so the last hope of the wretched Ludovico and his generals must needs be in their disguise. And so it was. San Severino and his brothers took their place in the ranks of the infantry, and Sforza took his among the baggage, clad in a monk's frock, with the hood pulled over his eyes. The army marched off, but the Swiss, who had first trafficked in their blood, now trafficked in their honour. The French were warned of the disguise of Sforza and his generals, and thus they were all 4 recognized, and Sforza was arrested by Trémouille himself. It is said that the price paid for this treason was the town of Bellinzona, for it then belonged to the French, and when the Swiss returned to their mountains and took possession of it, Louis XII took no steps to get it back again. When Ascanio Sforza, who, as we know, had stayed at Milan, learned the news of this cowardly desertion, he supposed that his cause was lost, and that it would be the best plan for him to fly, before he found himself a prisoner in the hands of his brother's old subjects. Such a change of face on the people's part would be very natural, and they might propose perhaps to purchase their own pardon at the price of his liberty. So he fled by night with the chief nobles of the Ghibelline party, taking the road to Piacenza on his way to the kingdom of Naples. But when he arrived at Rivolta, he remembered that there was living in that town an old friend of his childhood, by name Conrad Lando, whom he had helped to much wealth in his days of power, and as Ascanio and his companions were extremely tired, he resolved to beg his hospitality for a single night. Conrad received them with every sign of joy, putting all his house and servants at their disposal. But scarcely had they retired to bed, when he sent a runner to Piacenza to inform Carlo Orsini, at that time commanding the Venetian garrison, that he was prepared to deliver up Cardinal Ascanio and the chief men of the Milanese army. Carlo Orsini did not care to resign to another so important an expedition, and mounting hurriedly with 25 men, he first surrounded Conrad's house, and then entered, sword in hand, the chamber wherein Ascanio and his companions lay, and being surprised in the middle of their sleep, they yielded without resistance. The prisoners were taken to Venice, but Louis XII claimed them, and they were given up. Thus the King of France found himself master of Ludovico Sforza and of Ascanio, of a legitimate nephew of the great Francesco Sforza, named Hermes, of the 2 bastards, named Alessandro and Cortino, and of Francesco, son of the unhappy John Galeazza, who had been poisoned by his uncle. Louis XII, wishing to make an end of the whole family at a blow, forced Francesco to enter cloister, shut up Cardinal Ascanio in the Tower of Borges, threw into prison Alessandro, Cortino, and Hermes, and finally, after transferring the wretched Ludovico from the fortress of Pierre-Roussis to Lys Saint-Georges, he relegated him for good and all to the castle of Loches, where he lived for 10 years in solitude and utter destitution, and there died, cursing the day when the idea first came into his head of enticing the French into Italy. The news of the catastrophe of Ludovico and his family caused the greatest joy at Rome, for, while the French were consolidating their power in Milanese territory, the Holy See was gaining ground in the Romagna, where no further opposition was offered to Caesar's conquest. So the runners who brought the news were rewarded with valuable presents, and it was published throughout the whole town of Rome, to the sound of the trumpet and drum. The war cry of Louis, France, and that of Orsini also, ran through all the streets, which in the evening were illuminated, as though Constantinople or Jerusalem had been taken. And the Pope gave the people fetes and fireworks, without troubling his head the least in the world, either about its being a Holy Week, or because the Jubilee had attracted more than 200,000 people to Rome, the temporal interests of his family seeming to him far more important than the spiritual interests of his subjects. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 20. The Borgias, Chapter 11, Part 1. One thing alone was wanting to assure the success of the vast projects that the Pope and his son were founding upon the friendship of Louis and an alliance with him, that is, money. But Alexander was not the man to be troubled about a paltry worry of that kind. True, the sale of benefices was by now exhausted, the ordinary and extraordinary taxes had already been collected for the whole year, and the prospect of inheritance from cardinals and priests was a poor thing now that the richest of them had been poisoned. But Alexander had other means at his disposal, which were none the less efficacious because they were less often used. The first he employed was to spread a report that the Turks were threatening an invasion of Christendom, and that he knew for a positive fact that before the end of the summer Bajazet would land 2 considerable armies, one in Romagna, the other in Calabria. He therefore published 2 bulls, one to levy tithes of all ecclesiastical revenues in Europe of whatever nature they might be, the other to force the Jews into paying an equivalent sum. Both bulls contained the severest sentences of excommunication against those who refused to submit, or attempted opposition. The second plan was the selling of indulgences, a thing which had never been done before. These indulgences affected the people who had been prevented by reasons of health or business from coming to Rome for the Jubilee. The journey by this expedient was rendered unnecessary, and sins were pardoned for a third of what it would have cost, and just as completely as if the faithful had fulfilled every condition of the pilgrimage. For gathering in this tax, a veritable army of collectors was instituted, a certain Lodovico della Torre at their head. The sum that Alexander brought into the pontifical treasury is incalculable, and some idea of it may be gathered from the fact that 799,000 livres in gold was paid in from the territory of Venice alone. But as the Turks did as a fact make some sort of demonstration from the Hungarian side, and the Venetians began to fear that they might be coming in their direction, they asked for help from the Pope, who gave orders that at 12 o'clock in the day, in all his states an Ave Maria should be said to pray God to avert the danger which was threatening the most serene republic. This was the only help the Venetians got from his Holiness in exchange for the 799,000 livres in gold that he had got from them. But it seemed as though God wished to show his strange vicar on earth that he was angered by the mockery of sacred things, and on the eve of St. Peter's Day, just as the Pope was passing the Campanile on his way to the tribune of benedictions, an enormous piece of iron broke off and fell at his feet, and then, as though one warning had not been enough, on the next day, St. Peter's, when the Pope happened to be in one of the rooms of his ordinary dwelling with the Cardinal Capuano and Monsignore Poto, his private chamberlain, he saw through the open windows that a very black cloud was coming up. Foreseeing a thunderstorm, he ordered the cardinal and the chamberlain to shut the windows. He had not been mistaken, for even as they were obeying his command, there came up such a furious gust of wind that the highest chimney of the Vatican was overturned, just as a tree is rooted up, and was dashed upon the roof, breaking it in, smashing the upper flooring. It fell into the very room where they were. Terrified by the noise of this catastrophe, which made the whole palace tremble, the cardinal and Monsignore Poto turned round, and seeing the room full of dust and debris, sprang out upon the parapet and shouted to the guards at the gate, "The Pope is dead! The Pope is dead!" At this cry the guards ran up, and discovered 3 persons lying in the rubbish on the floor, one dead and the other 2 dying. The dead man was a gentleman of Siena called Lorenzo Chigi, and the dying were 2 resident officials of the Vatican. They had been walking across the floor above, and had been flung down with the debris. But Alexander was not to be found, and as he gave no answer, though they kept on calling to him, the belief that he had perished was confirmed, and very soon spread about the town. But he had only fainted, and at the end of a certain time he began to come to himself, and moaned, whereupon he was discovered, dazed with the blow, and injured, though not seriously, in several parts of his body. He had been saved by little short of a miracle. A beam had broken in half, and had left each of its 2 ends in the side walls, and one of these had formed a sort of roof over the pontifical throne. The Pope, who was sitting there at the time, was protected by this overarching beam, and had received only a few contusions. The 2 contradictory reports of the sudden death and the miraculous preservation of the Pope spread rapidly through Rome, and the Duke of Valentinois, terrified at the thought of what a change might be wrought in his own fortunes by any slight accident to the Holy Father, hurried to the Vatican, unable to assure himself by anything less than the evidence of his own eyes. Alexander desired to render public thanks to Heaven for the protection that had been granted him, and on the very same day was carried to the church of Santa Maria del Popolo. Escorted by a numerous procession of prelates and men at arms, his pontifical seat borne by 2 valets, 2 equerries, and 2 grooms. In this church were buried the Duke of Gandia and Gian Borgia, and perhaps Alexander was drawn thither by some relics of devotion, or maybe by the recollection of his love for his former mistress, Rosa Bonazza, whose image, in the guise of the Madonna, was exposed for the veneration of the faithful in a chapel on the left of the high altar. Stopping before this altar, the Pope offered to the church the gift of a magnificent chalice in which were 300 gold crowns, which the Cardinal of Siena poured out into a silver paten before the eyes of all, much to the gratification of the pontifical vanity. But before he left Rome to complete the conquest of the Romagna, the Duke of Valentinois had been reflecting that the marriage, once so ardently desired, between Lucrezia and Alfonso had been quite useless to himself and his father. There was more than this to be considered. Louis XII's rest in Lombardy was only a halt, and Milan was evidently but the stage before Naples. It was very possible that Louis was annoyed about the marriage which converted his enemy's nephew into the son-in-law of his ally. Whereas, if Alfonso were dead, Lucrezia would be in the position to marry some powerful lord of Ferrara or Brescia, who would be able to help his brother-in-law in the conquest of Romagna. Alfonso was now not only useless but dangerous, which to any one with the character of the Borgias perhaps seemed worse. The death of Alfonso was resolved upon. But Lucrezia's husband, who had understood for a long time past what danger he incurred by living near his terrible father-in-law, had retired to Naples. Since, however, neither Alexander nor Caesar had changed in their perpetual dissimulation towards him, he was beginning to lose his fear, when he received an invitation from the Pope and his son to take part in a bullfight which was to be held in the Spanish fashion in honor of the Duke before his departure. In the present precarious position of Naples, it would not have been good policy for Alfonso to afford Alexander any sort of pretext for a rupture, so he could not refuse without a motive, and betook himself to Rome. It was thought of no use to consult Lucrezia in this affair, for she had 2 or 3 times displayed an absurd attachment for her husband, and they left her undisturbed in her government of Spoleto. Alfonso was received by the Pope and the Duke with every demonstration of sincere friendship, and rooms in the Vatican were assigned to him that he had inhabited before with Lucrezia, in that part of the building which is known as the Torre Nuova. Great lists were prepared on the piazza of St. Peter's, the streets about it were barricaded, and the windows of the surrounding houses served as boxes for the spectators. The Pope and his court took their places on the balconies of the Vatican. The fete was started by professional toreadors, after they had exhibited their strength and skill. Alfonso and Caesar in their turn descended to the arena, and to offer a proof of their mutual kindness, settled that the bull which pursued Caesar should be killed by Alfonso, and the bull that pursued Alfonso by Caesar. Then Caesar remained alone on horseback within the lists, Alfonso going out by an improvised door which was kept ajar, in order that he might go back on the instant if he judged that his presence was necessary. At the same time, from the opposite side of the lists the bull was introduced, and was at the same moment pierced all over with darts and arrows, some of them containing explosives, which took fire, and irritated the bull to such a point that he rolled about with pain, and then got up in a fury, and perceiving a man on horseback, rushed instantly upon him. It was now, in this narrow arena, pursued by his swift enemy, that Caesar displayed all that skill which made him one of the finest horsemen of the period. Still, clever as he was, he could not have remained safe long in that restricted area from an adversary against whom he had no other resource than flight, had not Alfonso appeared suddenly, just when the bull was beginning to gain upon him, waving a red cloak in his left hand, and holding in his right a long, delicate Aragon sword. It was high time; the bull was only a few paces distant from Caesar, and the risk he was running appeared so imminent that a woman's scream was heard from one of the windows. but at the sight of a man on foot the bull stopped short, and judging that he would do better business with the new enemy than the old one, he turned upon him instead. For a moment he stood motionless, roaring, kicking up the dust with his hind feet, and lashing his sides with his tail. Then he rushed upon Alfonso, his eyes all bloodshot, his horns tearing up the ground. Alfonso awaited him with a tranquil air; then, when he was only 3 paces away, he made a bound to one side, and presented instead of his body his sword, which disappeared at once to the hilt. The bull, checked in the middle of his onslaught, stopped one instant motionless and trembling, then fell upon his knees, uttered one dull roar, and lying down on the very spot where his course had been checked, breathed his last without moving a single step forward. Applause resounded on all sides, so rapid and clever had been the blow. Caesar had remained on horseback, seeking to discover the fair spectator who had given so lively a proof of her interest in him, without troubling himself about what was going on. His search had not been unrewarded, for he had recognized one of the maids of honor to Elizabeth, Duchess of Urbino, who was betrothed to Gian Battista Caricualo, Captain General of the Republic of Venice. It was now Alfonso's turn to run from the bull, Caesar's to fight him. The young men changed parts, and when 4 mules had reluctantly dragged the dead bull from the arena, and the valets and other servants of his holiness had scattered sand over the places that were stained with blood, Alfonso mounted a magnificent Andalusian steed of Arab origin, light as the wind of Sahara that had wedded with his mother, while Caesar, dismounting, retired in his turn, to reappear at the moment when Alfonso should be meeting the same danger from which he had just now rescued him. Then a second bull was introduced upon the scene, excited in the same manner with steel darts and flaming arrows. Like his predecessor, when he perceived a man on horseback he rushed upon him, and then began a marvellous race, in which it was impossible to see, so quickly did they fly over the ground, whether the horse was pursuing the bull, or the bull the horse. But after 5 or 6 rounds, the bull began to gain upon the son of Araby, for all his speed, and it was plain to see who fled and who pursued. In another moment there was only the length of 2 lances between them, and then suddenly Caesar appeared, armed with one of those long 2-handed swords which the French are accustomed to use, and just when the bull, almost close upon Don Alfonso, came in front of Caesar he brandished the sword, which flashed like lightning and cut off his head, while his body, impelled by the speed of the run, fell to the ground 10 paces farther on. This blow was so unexpected, and had been performed with such dexterity, that it was received, not with mere clapping, but with wild enthusiasm and frantic outcry. Caesar, apparently remembering nothing else in his hour of triumph but the scream that had been caused by his former danger, picked up the bull's head, and, giving it to one of his equerries, ordered him to lay it, as an act of homage, at the feet of the fair Venetian who had bestowed upon him so lively a sign of interest. This fate, besides affording a triumph to each of the young men, had another end as well. It was meant to prove to the populace that perfect goodwill existed between the two, since each had saved the life of the other. The result was, that, if any accident should happen to Caesar, nobody would dream of accusing Alfonso, and if any accident should happen to Alfonso, nobody would dream of accusing Caesar. There was a supper at the Vatican. Alfonso made an elegant toilet, and about 10 o'clock at night prepared to go from the quarters he inhabited into those where the Pope lived. But the door which separated the 2 courts of the building was shut, and knock as he would, no one came to open it. Alfonso then thought that it was a simple matter for him to go round by the Piazza of St. Peter, so he went out unaccompanied through one of the garden gates of the Vatican and made his way across the gloomy streets which led to the stairway which gave on the piazza. But scarcely had he set foot on the first step when he was attacked by a band of armed men. Alfonso would have drawn his sword, but before it was out of the scabbard he had received 2 blows from a halberd, one on his head, the other on his shoulder. He was stabbed in the side, and wounded both in the leg and in the temple. Struck down by these 5 blows, he lost his footing and fell to the ground unconscious. His assassins, supposing he was dead, at once remounted the stairway, and found on the piazza 40 horsemen waiting for them. By them they were calmly escorted from the city by the Porta Portesa. Alfonso was found at the point of death, but not actually dead, by some passers-by, some of whom recognized him, and instantly conveyed the news of his assassination to the Vatican, while the others, lifting the wounded man in their arms, carried him to his quarters in the Torre Nuova. The Pope and Caesar, who learned this news just as they were sitting down to table, showed great distress, and leaving their companions, at once went to see Alfonso, to be quite certain whether his wounds were fatal or not; and on the next morning, to divert any suspicion that might be turned towards themselves, they arrested Alfonso's maternal uncle, Francesco Gazella, who had come to Rome in his nephew's company. Gazella was found guilty on the evidence of false witnesses, and was consequently beheaded. But they had only accomplished half of what they wanted. By some means, fair or foul, suspicion had been sufficiently diverted from the true assassins. But Alfonso was not dead; and thanks to the strength of his constitution and the skill of his doctors, who had taken the lamentations of the Pope and Caesar quite seriously, and thought to please them by curing Alexander's son-in-law, the wounded man was making progress towards convalescence. News arrived at the same time that Lucrezia had heard of her husband's accident, and was starting to come and nurse him herself. There was no time to lose, and Caesar summoned Micheletto. The same night, says Bucardus, Don Alfonso, who would not die of his wounds, was found strangled in his bed. The funeral took place the next day with a ceremony not unbecoming in itself, though unsuited to his high rank. Don Francesco Baggia, Archbishop of Cosenza, acted as chief mourner at St. Peter's, where the body was buried in the chapel of Santa Maria della Febbre. Lucrezia arrived the same evening. She knew her father and brother too well to be put on the wrong scent; and although immediately after Alfonso's death the Duke of Valentinois had arrested the doctors, the surgeons, and a poor deformed wretch who had been acting as valet, she knew perfectly well from what quarter the blow had proceeded. In fear, therefore, that the manifestation of a grief she felt at this time too well might alienate the confidence of her father and brother, she retired to Nepi with her whole household, her whole court, and more than 600 cavaliers, there to spend the period of her mourning. This important family business was now settled, and Lucrezia was again a widow, and in consequence ready to be utilized in the Pope's new political machinations. Caesar only stayed at Rome to receive the ambassadors from France and Venice; but as their arrival was somewhat delayed, and considerable inroads had been made upon the Pope's treasury by the recent festivities, the creation of 12 new cardinals was arranged. This scheme was to have two effects, viz., to bring 600,000 ducats into the pontifical chest, each hat having been priced at 50,000 ducats, and to assure the Pope of a constant majority in the Sacred Council. Section 21 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 21. The Borgias, Chapter 11, Part 2. The ambassadors at last arrived. The first was M. de Villeneuve, the same who had come before to see the Duke of Valentinois in the name of France. Just as he entered Rome, he met on the road a masked man who, without removing his domino, expressed the joy he felt at his arrival. This man was Caesar himself, who did not wish to be recognized, and who took his departure after a short conference without uncovering his face. M. de Villeneuve then entered the city after him, and at the Porta del Populo found the ambassadors of the various powers, and among them those of Spain and Naples, whose sovereigns were not yet, it is true, in declared hostility to France, though there was already some coolness. The last named, fearing to compromise themselves, merely said to their colleague of France, by way of complimentary address, "Sir, you are welcome," whereupon the master of the ceremonies, surprised at the brevity of the greeting, asked if they had nothing else to say. When they replied that they had not, M. de Villeneuve turned his back upon them, remarking that those who had nothing to say required no answer. He then took his place between the Archbishop of Reggio, Governor of Rome, and the Archbishop of Ragusa, and made his way to the Palace of the Holy Apostles, which had been got ready for his reception. Some days later, Maria Giorgi, Ambassador Extraordinary of Venice, made his arrival. he was commissioned not only to arrange the business on hand with the pope, but also to convey to Alexander and Caesar the title of Venetian nobles, and to inform them that their names were inscribed in the golden book, a favor that both of them had long coveted, less for the empty honor's sake than for the new influence that this title might confer. Then the pope went on to bestow the 12 cardinals' hats that had been sold. The new princes of the church were Don Diego de Mendoza, Archbishop of Seville; Jacques, Archbishop of Oristany; the pope's vicar general, Thomas, Archbishop of Strigania; Piero, Archbishop of Reggio; governor of Rome, Francesco Bargia, Archbishop of Cosenza; treasurer general, Gian, Archbishop of Salerno, vice chamberlain; Luigi Bargia, Archbishop of Valencia, secretary to his holiness, and brother of the Gian Borgia whom Caesar had poisoned; Antonio, Bishop of Coma; Gian Battista Ferraro, Bishop of Modena; Amadei d'Albret, son of the king of Navarre, brother-in-law of the Duke of Valentinois; and Marco Cornaro, a Venetian noble, in whose person his holiness rendered back to the most serene republic the favor he had just received. Then, as there was nothing further to detain the Duke of Valentinois at Rome, he only waited to effect a loan from a rich banker named Agostino Chigi, brother of the Lorenzo Chigi who had perished on the day when the pope had been nearly killed by the fall of a chimney, and departed for the Romagna, accompanied by Vitellozzo Vitelli, Gian Paolo Baglioni, and Jacopo di Santa Croce, at the time his friends, but later on his victims. His first enterprise was against Pesaro. This was the polite attention of a brother-in-law, and Gian Sforza very well knew what would be its consequences; for instead of attempting to defend his possessions by taking up arms, or venture on negotiations, unwilling moreover to expose the fair lands he had ruled so long to the vengeance of an irritated foe, he begged his subjects to preserve their former affection towards himself, in the hope of better days to come, and he fled into Dalmatia. Malatesta, lord of Rimini, followed his example. Thus the Duke of Valentinois entered both these towns without striking a single blow. Caesar left a sufficient garrison behind him, and marched on to Faenza. But there the face of things was changed. Faenza at that time was under the rule of Astor Manfredi, a brave and handsome young man of 18, who, relying on the love of his subjects towards his family, had resolved on defending himself to the uttermost, although he had been forsaken by the Bentivogli, his near relatives, and by his allies, the Venetian and Florentines, who had not dared to send him any aid because of the affection felt towards Caesar by the king of France. Accordingly, when he perceived that the Duke of Valentinois was marching against him, he assembled in hot haste all those of his vassals who were capable of bearing arms, together with the few foreign soldiers who were willing to come into his pay, and collecting victual and ammunition, he took up his position with them inside the town. By these defensive preparations Caesar was not greatly disconcerted. He commanded a magnificent army, composed of the finest troops of France and Italy, led by such men as Paolo and Giulio Orsini, Vitellozzo Vitelli, and Paolo Baglione, not to speak of himself, that is to say, by the first captains of the period. So, after he had reconnoitred, he at once began the siege, pitching his camp between the two rivers, Amana and Marziano, placing his artillery on the side which faces on Forli, at which point the besieged army had erected a powerful bastion. At the end of a few days busy with entrenchments, the breach became practicable, and the Duke of Valentinois ordered an assault, and gave the example to his soldiers by being the first to march against the enemy. But in spite of his courage and that of his captains beside him, Astor Manfredi made so good a defense that the besiegers were repulsed with great loss of men, while one of their bravest leaders, Onario Savella, was left behind in the trenches. But Faenza, in spite of the courage and devotion of her defenders, could not have held out long against so formidable an army, had not winter come to her aid. Surprised by the rigor of the season, with no houses for protection and no trees for fuel, as the peasants had destroyed both beforehand, the Duke of Valentinois was forced to raise the siege and take up his winter quarters in the neighboring towns, in order to be quite ready for a return next spring; for Caesar could not forgive the insult of being held in check by a little town which had enjoyed a long time of peace, was governed by a mere boy, and deprived of all outside aid, and had sworn to take his revenge. He therefore broke up his army into 3 sections, sent 1/3 to Imola, the second to Forli, and himself took the third to Cesena, a third-rate town, which was thus suddenly transformed into a city of pleasure and luxury. Indeed, for Caesar's active spirit there must needs be no cessation of warfare or festivities; so, when war was interrupted, fetes began, as magnificent and as exciting as he knew how to make them. The days were passed in games and displays of horsemanship, the nights in dancing and gallantry, for the loveliest woman of the Romagna, that is to say of the whole world, had come hither to make a seraglio for the victor, which might have been envied by the Sultan of Egypt or the Emperor of Constantinople. While the Duke of Valentinois was making one of his excursions in the neighbourhood of the town with his retinue of flattering nobles and titled courtesans, who were always about him, he noticed a cortege on the Rimini road, so numerous that it must surely indicate the approach of someone of importance. Caesar, soon perceiving that the principal person was a woman, approached, and recognized the very same lady in waiting to the Duchess of Urbino who, on the day of the bullfight, had screamed when Caesar was all but touched by the infuriated beast. At this time she was betrothed, as we mentioned, to Gian Caracciulola, general of the Venetians. Elizabeth of Gonzaga, her protectress and grandmother, was now sending her with a suitable retinue to Venice, where the marriage was to take place. Caesar had already been struck by the beauty of this young girl when at Rome, but when he saw her again she appeared more lovely than on the first occasion; so he resolved on the instant that he would keep this fair flower of love for himself, having often before reproached himself for his indifference in passing her by. Therefore he saluted her as an old acquaintance, inquired whether she was staying any time at Cesena, and ascertained that she was only passing through, travelling by long stages, as she was awaited with much impatience, and that she would spend the coming night at Forli. This was all that Caesar cared to know. He summoned Micheletto, and in a low voice said a few words to him, which were heard by no one else. The cortege only made a halt at the neighbouring town, as the fair bride had said, and started at once for Forli, although the day was already far advanced. But scarcely had a league been covered when a troop of horsemen from Cesena overtook and surrounded them. Although the soldiers in the escort were far from being in sufficient force, they were eager to defend their general's bride; but soon some fell dead, and others, terrified, took to flight; and when the lady came down from her litter to try to escape, the chief seized her in his arms and set her in front of him on his horse; then, ordering his men to return to Cesena without him, he put his horse to the gallop in a cross direction, and as the shades of evening were now beginning to fall, he soon disappeared into the darkness. Caracciolo learned the news through one of the fugitives, who declared that he had recognized among the ravishers the Duke of Valentinois' soldiers. At first he thought his ears had deceived him, so hard was it to believe this terrible intelligence; but it was repeated, and he stood for one instant motionless and, as it were, thunderstruck. Then suddenly, with a cry of vengeance, he threw off his stupor and dashed away to the ducal palace, where sat the Doge Barberigo and the Council of Ten. Unannounced he rushed into their midst, the very moment after they had heard of Caesar's outrage. "Most serene lords," he cried, "I am come to bid you farewell, for I am resolved to sacrifice my life to my private vengeance, though indeed I had hoped to devote it to the service of the republic. I have been wounded in the soul's noblest part, in my honor. The dearest thing I possessed, my wife, has been stolen from me, and the thief is the most treacherous, the most impious, the most infamous of men. It is Valentinois. My lords, I beg you will not be offended if I speak thus of a man whose boast it is to be a member of your noble ranks, and to enjoy your protection. It is not so; he lies, and his loose and criminal life has made him unworthy of such honors, even as he is unworthy of the life whereof my sword shall deprive him. In truth, his very birth was a sacrilege. He is a fratricide, a usurper of the goods of other men, an oppressor of the innocent, and a highway assassin. He is a man who will violate every law, even the law of hospitality respected by the veriest barbarian; a man who will do violence to a virgin who is passing through his own country, where she had every right to expect from him not only the consideration due to her sex and condition, but also that which is due to the most serene republic, whose condottieri I am, and which is insulted in my person and in the dishonoring of my bride. This man, I say, merits indeed to die by another hand than mine. Yet, since he who ought to punish him is not for him a prince and judge, but only a father quite as guilty as the son, I myself will seek him out, and I will sacrifice my own life, not only in avenging my own injury, and the blood of so many innocent beings, but also in promoting the welfare of the most serene republic, on which it is his ambition to trample when he has accomplished the ruin of the other princes of Italy. The Doge and the senators, who, as we said, were already apprised of the event that had brought Caracciolo before them, listened with great interest and profound indignation, for they, as he told them, were themselves insulted in the person of their general. They all swore, on their honour, that if he would put the matter in their hands, and not yield to his rage, which could only work his own undoing, either his bride should be rendered up to him without a smirch upon her bridal veil, or else a punishment should be dealt out proportioned to the affront. And without delay, as a proof of the energy wherewith the noble tribunal would take action in the affair, Luigi Manetti, secretary to the Ten, was sent to Imola, where the Duke was reported to be, that he might explain to him the great displeasure with which the most serene republic viewed the outrage perpetrated upon their condottiere. At the same time the Council of Ten and the Doge sought out the French ambassador, entreating him to join with them and repair in person with Manenti to the Duke of Valentinois, and summon him, in the name of King Louis XII, immediately to send back to Venice the lady he had carried off. The two messengers arrived at Imola, where they found Caesar, who listened to their complaint with every mark of utter astonishment, denying that he had been in any way connected with the crime, nay, authorizing Manenti and the French ambassador to pursue the culprits, and promising that he would himself have the most active search carried on. The Duke appeared to act in such complete good faith that the envoys were for the moment hoodwinked, and themselves undertook a search of the most careful nature. They accordingly repaired to the exact spot and began to procure information. On the highroad there had been found dead and wounded. A man had been seen going by at a gallop, carrying a woman in distress on his saddle. He had soon left the beaten track and plunged across country. A peasant coming home from working in the fields had seen him appear and vanish again like a shadow, taking the direction of a lonely house. An old woman declared that she had seen him go into this house, but the next night the house was gone, as though by enchantment, and the ploughshare had passed over where it stood, so that none could say what had become of her whom they sought, for those who had dwelt in the house, and even the house itself, were there no longer. Manenti and the French ambassador returned to Venice, and related what the Duke had said, what they had done, and how all search had been in vain. No one doubted that Caesar was the culprit, but none could prove it. So the most serene republic, which could not, considering their war with the Turks, be embroiled with the Pope, forbade Caracciolo to take any sort of private vengeance, and so the talk grew gradually less, and at last the occurrence was no more mentioned. But the pleasures of the winter had not diverted Caesar's mind from his plans about Faenza. Scarcely did the spring season allow him to go into the country than he marched anew upon the town, camped opposite the castle, and, making a new breach, ordered a general assault, himself going up first of all. But in spite of the courage he personally displayed, and the able seconding of his soldiers, they were repulsed by Astor, who, at the head of his men, defended the breach, while even the women, at the top of the rampart, rolled down stones and trunks of trees upon the besiegers. After an hour's struggle man to man, Caesar was forced to retire, leaving 2,000 men in the trenches about the town, and among the 2,000 one of his bravest condottieri, Valentino Farnese. Then, seeing that neither excommunications nor assaults could help him, Caesar converted the siege into a blockade. All the roads leading to Faenza were cut off, all communications stopped, and further, as various signs of revolt had been remarked at Cesena, a governor was installed there whose powerful will was well known to Caesar, Ramiro d'Orco, with powers of life and death over the inhabitants. He then waited quietly before Faenza, till hunger should drive out the citizens from those walls they defended with such vehement enthusiasm. At the end of a month, during which the people of Faenza had suffered all the horrors of famine, delegates came out to parley with Caesar with a view to capitulation. Caesar, who still had plenty to do in the Romagna, was less hard to satisfy than might have been expected, and the town yielded on condition that he should not touch either the persons or the belongings of the inhabitants. that Alstor Manfredi, the youthful ruler, should have the privilege of retiring whenever he pleased, and should enjoy the revenue of his patrimony wherever he might be. The conditions were faithfully kept so far as the inhabitants were concerned, but Caesar, when he had seen Astor, whom he did not know before, was seized by a strange passion for this beautiful youth, who was like a woman. He kept him by his side in his own army, showing him honours befitting a young prince, and evincing before the eyes of all the strongest affection for him. One day Astor disappeared, just as Caragiolo's bride had disappeared, and no one knew what had become of him. Caesar himself appeared very uneasy, saying that he had no doubt made his escape somewhere, and in order to give credence to this story, he sent out couriers to seek him in all directions. A year after this double disappearance, there was picked up in the Tiber, a little below the castle Sant' Angelo, the body of a beautiful woman, her hands bound together behind her back, and also the corpse of a handsome youth, with the bowstring he had been strangled with tied around his neck. The girl was Caragiolo's bride, the young man was Astor. During the last year both had been the slaves of Caesar's pleasures. Now tired of them, he had had them thrown into the Tiber. The capture of Faenza had brought Caesar the title of Duke of Romagna, which was first bestowed on him by the Pope in full consistory, and afterwards ratified by the King of Hungary, the Republic of Venice, and the Kings of Castile and Portugal. The news of the ratification arrived at Rome on the eve of the day on which the people are accustomed to keep the anniversary of the foundation of the Eternal City. This fete, which went back to the days of Pomponius Laetus, acquired a new splendor in their eyes from the joyful events that had just happened to their sovereign. As a sign of joy, cannon were fired all day long. In the evening there were illuminations and bonfires, and during part of the night the Prince of Squillaci, with the chief lords of the Roman nobility, marched about the streets, bearing torches and exclaiming, "Long live Alexander! Long live Caesar! Long live the Borgias! Long live the Orsini! Long live the Duke of Romagna!" Section 21.
Section 22 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kevin Maxon. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives, Section 22, The Borgias. Chapter 12. Caesar's ambition was only fed by victories. Scarcely was he master of Faenza before, excited by the Mariscotti, old enemies of the Bentivoglio family, he cast his eyes upon Bologna. But John de Bentivoglio, whose ancestors had possessed this town from time immemorial, had not only made all preparations necessary for a long resistance, but he had also put himself under the protection of France. So scarcely had he learned that Caesar was crossing the frontier of the Bolognese territory with his army, than he sent a courier to Louis XII to claim the fulfillment of his promise. Louis kept it with his accustomed good faith, and when Caesar arrived before Bologna, he received an intimation from the King of France that he was not to enter on any undertaking against his ally Bentivoglio. Caesar, not being the man to have his plans upset for nothing, made conditions for his retreat, to which Bentivoglio consented, only too happy to be quit of him at this price. The conditions were the cession of Castello Bolognese, a fortress between Imola and Faenza, the payment of a tribute of 9,000 ducats, and the keeping for his service of 100 men-at-arms and 2,000 infantry. In exchange for these favors, Caesar confided to Bentivoglio that his visit had been due to the counsels of the Mariscotti. Then, reinforced by his new allies' contingent, he took the road for Tuscany. But he was scarcely out of sight when Bentivoglio shut the gates of Bologna, and commanded his son Hermes to assassinate with his own hand Agamemnon Mariscotti, the head of the family, and ordered the massacre of 34 of his near relatives, brothers, sons, daughters, and nephews, and 200 other of his kindred and friends. The butchery was carried out by the noblest youths of Bologna, whom Bentivoglio forced to bathe their hands in this blood, so that he might attach them to himself through their fear of reprisals. Caesar's plans with regard to Florence were now no longer a mystery. Since the month of January he had sent to Pisa for 10 or 1200 men under the command of Raniero della Saseta and Piero da Gamba Corti, and as soon as the conquest of the Romagna was complete, he had further dispatched Oliverotto di Fermo with new detachments. His own army had he reinforced, as we have seen, by 100 men-at-arms and 2,000 infantry. He had just been joined by Vitellozzo Vitelli, lord of Citta di Castello, and by the Orsini, who had brought him another 2,000 or 3,000 men. So without counting the troops sent to Pisa, he had under his control 700 men-at-arms and 5,000 infantry. Still, in spite of this formidable company, he entered Tuscany declaring that his intentions were only pacific, protesting that he only desired to pass through the territories of the Republic on his way to Rome, and offering to pay in ready money for any victual his army might require. But when he had passed the defiles of the mountains and arrived at Barberino, feeling that the town was in his power, and nothing could now hinder his approach, he began to put a price on the friendship he had at first offered freely, and to impose his own conditions, instead of accepting those of others. These were that Piero de' Medici, kinsman and ally of the Orsini, should be reinstated in his ancient power, that 6 Florentine citizens, to be chosen by Vitellozzo, should be put into his hands, that they might by their death expiate that of Paolo Vitelli, unjustly executed by the Florentines, that the Signoria should engage to give no aid to the lord of Piombino, whom Caesar intended to dispossess of his estates without delay, and further, that he himself should be taken into the service of the Republic, for a pay proportionate to his deserts. But just as Caesar had reached this point in his negotiations with Florence, he received orders from Louis XII to get ready, so soon as he conveniently could, to follow him with his army, and to help in the conquest of Naples, which he was at last in a position to undertake. Caesar dared not break his word to so powerful an ally. He therefore replied that he was at the king's orders, and as the Florentines were not aware that he was acquitting them on compulsion, he sold his retreat for the sum of 36,000 ducats per annum, in exchange for which sum he was to hold 300 men-at-arms, always in readiness to go to the aid of the Republic at her earliest call and in any circumstances of need. But hurried as he was, Caesar still hoped that he might find time to conquer the territory of Piombino as he went by, and take the capital by a single vigorous stroke. So he made his entry into the lands of Jacopo IV of Appiano. The latter, he found, however, had been beforehand with him, and, to rob him of all resource, had laid waste in his own country, burned his fodder, felled his trees, torn down his vines, and destroyed a few fountains that produced salubrious waters. This did not hinder Caesar from seizing in the space of a few days Severeto, Scarlino, the Isle of Elba, and La Pianosa, but he was obliged to stop short at the castle, which opposed a serious resistance. As Louis XII's army was continuing its way towards Rome, and he received a fresh order to join it, he took his departure the next day, leaving behind him Vitellozzo and Gianpaolo Baliani to prosecute the siege in his absence. Louis XII was this time advancing upon Naples, not with the incautious ardor of Charles VIII, but, on the contrary, with that prudence and circumspection which characterized him. Besides his alliance with Florence and Rome, he had also signed a secret treaty with Ferdinand the Catholic, who had similar pretensions, through the house of Duras, to the throne of Naples, to those Louis himself had through the house of Anjou. By this treaty the two kings were sharing their conquests beforehand. Louis would be the master of Naples, of the town of Lavore and the Abruzzi, and would bear the title of King of Naples and Jerusalem. Ferdinand reserved for his own share the Apulia and Calabria, with the title of Duke of these provinces. Both were to receive the investiture from the Pope, and to hold them of him. This partition was all the more likely to be made, in fact, because Frederick, supposing all the time that Ferdinand was his good and faithful friend, would open the gates of his towns, only to receive into his fortresses conquerors and masters, instead of allies. All this perhaps was not very loyal conduct on the part of a king who had so long desired, and had just now received the surname of Catholic, but it mattered little to Louis, who profited by treasonable acts he did not have to share. The French army, which the Duke of Valentinois had just joined, consisted of 1,000 lances, 4,000 Swiss, and 6,000 Gascons and adventurers. Further, Philip of Rabenstein was bringing by sea 6 Breton and Provençal vessels, and 3 Genoese carracks, carrying 6,500 invaders. Against this mighty host, the King of Naples had only 700 men-at-arms, 600 light horse, and 6,000 infantry under the command of the Colonna, whom he had taken into his pay after they were exiled by the Pope from the States of the Church, but he was counting on Gonsalvo of Cordova, who was to join him at Gaeta, and to whom he had confidingly opened all his fortresses in Calabria. But the feeling of safety inspired by Frederick's faithless ally was not destined to endure long. On their arrival at Rome, the French and Spanish ambassadors presented to the Pope the treaty signed at Granada on the 11th of November, 1500, between Louis XII and Ferdinand the Catholic, a treaty which up to that time had been secret. Alexander, foreseeing the probable future, had, by the death of Alfonso, loosened all the bonds that attached him to the House of Aragon, and then began by making some difficulty about it. It was demonstrated that the arrangement had only been undertaken to provide the Christian princes with another weapon for attacking the Ottoman Empire, and before this consideration, one may readily suppose, all the Pope's scruples vanished. On the 25th of June, therefore, it was decided to call a consistory which was to declare Frederick deposed from the throne of Naples. When Frederick had heard all at once that the French army had arrived at Rome, that his ally Ferdinand had deceived him, and that Alexander had pronounced the sentence of his downfall, he understood that all was lost. But he did not wish it to be said that he had abandoned his kingdom without even attempting to save it. So he charged his two new condottieri, Fabrizio Colonna and Ranuzio di Marciano, to check the French before Capua with 300 men-at-arms, some light horse, and 3,000 infantry. In person he occupied Aversa with another division of his army, while Prospero Colonna was sent to defend Naples with the rest, and make a stand against the Spaniards on the side of Calabria. These dispositions were scarcely made when d'Aubigné, having passed the Volturno, approached to lay siege to Capua, and invested the town on both sides of the river. Scarcely were the French encamped before the ramparts that they began to set up their batteries, which were soon in play, much to the terror of the besieged, who, poor creatures, were almost strangers to the town, and had fled thither from every side, expecting to find protection beneath the walls. So although bravely repulsed by Fabrizio Colonna, the French, from the moment of their first assault, inspired so great and blind a terror that everyone began to talk of opening the gates, and it was only with great difficulty that Colonna made this multitude understand that at least they ought to reap some benefit from the check the besiegers had received, and obtain good terms of capitulation. When he had brought them round to his view, he sent out to demand a parley with d'Aubigné, and a conference was fixed for the next day, but one in which they were to treat of the surrender of the town. But this was not Caesar Borgia's idea at all. He had stayed behind to confer with the Pope, and had joined the French army with some of his troops on the very day on which the conference had been arranged for 2 days later, and a capitulation of any nature would rob him of his share of the booty and the promise of such pleasure as would come from the capture of a city so rich and populous as Capua. So he opened up negotiations on his own account, with a captain who was on guard at one of the gates. Such negotiations, made with cunning supported by bribery, proved as usual more prompt and efficacious than any others. At the very moment when Fabrizio Colonna, in a fortified outpost, was discussing the conditions of capitulation with the French captains, suddenly great cries of distress were heard. These were caused by Borgia, who without a word to anyone had entered the town with his faithful army from Romagna, and was beginning to cut the throats of the garrison, which had naturally somewhat relaxed their vigilance in the belief that the capitulation was all but signed. The French, when they saw that the town was half taken, rushed on the gates with such impetuosity that the besieged did not even attempt to defend themselves any longer, and forced their way into Capua by 3 separate sides. Nothing more could be done then to stop the issue. Butchery and pillage had begun, and the work of destruction must needs be completed. In vain did Fabrizio Colonna, Ranuzio di Marciano, and Don Ugo di Cordona attempt to make head against the French and Spaniards with such men as they could get together. Fabrizio Colonna and Don Ugo were made prisoners. Ranuzio, wounded by an arrow, fell into the hands of the Duke of Valentinois. 7,000 inhabitants were massacred in the streets, among them the traitor who had given up the gate. The churches were pillaged, the convents of nuns forced open, and then might be seen the spectacle of some of these holy virgins casting themselves into pits, or into the river to escape the soldiers. 300 of the noblest ladies of the town took refuge in a tower. The Duke of Valentinois broke in the doors, chased out for himself 40 of the most beautiful, and handed over the rest to his army. The pillage continued for 3 days. Capua once taken, Frederick saw that it was useless any longer to attempt defense, so he shut himself up in Castel Nuovo, and gave permission to Gaeta and to Naples to treat with the conqueror. Gaeta brought him immunity from pillage with 60,000 ducats, and Naples with the surrender of the castle. This surrender was made to Daubigny by Frederick himself, a condition that he should be allowed to take the island of Ischia, his money, jewels, and furniture, and there remain with his family for 6 months secure from all hostile attack. The terms of this capitulation were faithfully adhered to on both sides. Daubigny entered Naples, and Frederick retired to Ischia. Thus, by a last terrible blow, never to rise again, fell this branch of the House of Aragon, which had now reigned for 65 years. Frederick, its head, demanded and obtained safe conduct to pass into France, where Louis XII gave him the Duchy of Anjou and 30,000 ducats a year, and conditioned that he should never quit the kingdom, and there, in fact, he died, on the 9th of September, 1504. His eldest son, Dan Ferdinand, Duke of Calabria, retired to Spain, where he was permitted to marry twice, but each time with a woman who was known to be barren, and there he died in 1550. Alfonso, the second son, who had followed his father to France, died, it is said, of poison at Grenoble, at the age of 22. Lastly, Caesar, the third son, died at Ferrara, before he had attained his 18th birthday. Frederick's daughter Charlotte married in France Nicholas, Count of Laval, governor and admiral of Brittany. A daughter was born of this marriage, Anne de Laval, who married Francois de la Trémouille. Through her, those rights were transferred to the house of La Trémouille, which were used later as a claim upon the kingdom of the Two Sicilies. The capture of Naples gave the Duke of Valentinois his liberty again, so he left the French army after he had received fresh assurances on his own account of the king's friendliness, and returned to the siege of Piombino, which he had been forced to interrupt. During this interval, Alexander had been visiting the scenes of his son's conquests, and traversing all the Romagna with Lucrezia, who was now consoled for her cousin's death, and had never before enjoyed such favor with his holiness. So, when she returned to Rome, she no longer had separate rooms from him. The result of this recrudescence of affection was the appearance of 2 pontifical bulls, converting the towns of Nepi and Sermonetta into duchies. One was bestowed on John Bargia, an illegitimate child of the Pope, who was not the son of either of his mistresses, Rosa Venozza or Giulia Varnese. The other, and Don Roderico of Aragon, son of Lucrezia and Alfonso. The lands of the Colonna were an appanage to the 2 duchies. But Alexander was dreaming of yet another addition to his fortune. This was to come from a marriage between Lucrezia and Don Alfonso d'Este, son of Duke Hercules of Ferrara, in favor of which alliance Louis XII had negotiated. His Holiness was now having a run of good fortune, and he learned on the same day that Piombino was taken, and that Duke Hercules had given the King of France his assent to the marriage. Both of these pieces of news were good for Alexander, but the one could not compare in importance with the other. And the intimation that Lucrezia was to marry the heir presumptive to the Duchy of Ferrara was received with a joy so great that it smacked of the humble beginnings of the Borgian house. The Duke of Valentinois was invited to return to Rome, to take his share in the family rejoicing, and on the day when the news was made public, the governor of Sant'Angelo received orders that cannon should be fired every quarter of an hour from noon to midnight. At 2 o'clock, Lucrezia, attired as a fiancée, and accompanied by her 2 brothers, the Dukes of Valentinois and Squillace, issued from the Vatican, followed by all the nobility of Rome, and proceeded to the church of the Madonna del Popolo, where the Duke of Gandia and Cardinal Gian Borgia were buried, to render thanks for this new favor accorded to their house by God. And in the evening, accompanied by the same cavalcade, which shone the more brightly under the torchlight and brilliant illuminations, she made procession through the whale town, greeted by cries of "Long live Pope Alexander VI! Long live the Duchess of Ferrara!" which were shouted aloud by heralds clad in cloth of gold. The next day an announcement was made in the town that a race course for the women was opened between the castle of Sant'Angelo and the Piazza of St. Peter's, that on every 3rd day there would be a bullfight in the Spanish fashion, and that from the end of the present month, which was October, until the 1st day of Lent, masquerades would be permitted in the streets of Rome. Such was the nature of the fetes outside, the program of those going on within the Vatican was not presented to the people, for by the account of Bucciardo, an eye-witness, this is what happened. On the last Sunday of the month of October, 50 courtesans supped in the Apostolic Palace in the Duke of Valentinois' rooms, and after supper danced with the equerries and servants, first wearing their usual garments, afterwards in dazzling draperies. When supper was over, the table was removed, candlesticks were set on the floor in a symmetrical pattern, and a great quantity of chestnuts was scattered on the ground. These the 50 women skilfully picked up, running about gracefully in and about between the burning lights. The Pope, the Duke of Valentinois, and his sister Lucrezia, who were looking on at this spectacle from a gallery, encouraged the most agile and industrious with their applause, and they received prizes of embroidered garters, velvet boots, golden caps, and laces. Then new diversions took the place of these. We humbly ask forgiveness of our readers, and especially of our lady readers, but though we have found words to describe the first part of the spectacle, we have sought them in vain for the second. Suffice it to say, that just as there had been prizes for feats of adroitness, others were given now to the dancers who were most daring and brazen. Some days after this strange night, which calls to mind the Roman evenings in the days of Tiberius, Nero, and Heliogabalus, Lucrezia, clad in a robe of golden brocade, her train carried by young girls dressed in white and crowned with roses, issued from her palace to the sound of trumpets and clarions, and made her way over carpets that were laid down in the streets through which she had to pass. Accompanied by the noblest cavaliers and the loveliest women in Rome, she betook herself to the Vatican, where in the Pauline Hall the Pope waited her, with the Duke of Valentinois, Don Ferdinand acting as proxy for the Duke Alfonso, and his cousin, Cardinal d'Este. The Pope sat on one side of the table, while the envoys from Ferrara stood on the other. In their midst came Lucrezia, and Don Ferdinand placed on her finger the nuptial ring. This ceremony over, Cardinal d'Este approached and presented to the bride 4 magnificent rings set with precious stones. Then a casket was placed on the table, richly inlaid with ivory, whence the cardinal drew forth a great many trinkets, chains, necklaces of pearls, and diamonds, of workmanship as costly as their material. These he also begged Lucrezia to accept, before she received those the bridegroom was hoping to offer himself, which would be more worthy of her. Lucrezia showed the utmost delight in accepting these gifts. Then she retired into the next room, leaning on the Pope's arm, and followed by the ladies of her suite, leaving the Duke of Valentinois to do the honors of the Vatican to the men. That evening the guests met again, and spent half the night in dancing, while a magnificent display of fireworks lighted up the Piazza of San Paolo. The ceremony of betrothal over, the Pope and the Duke busied themselves with making preparations for the departure. The Pope, who wished the journey to be made with a great degree of splendor, sent in his daughter's company, in addition to the 2 brothers-in-law and gentlemen in their suite, the Senate of Rome and all the lords who, by virtue of their wealth, could display most magnificence in their costumes and liveries. Among this brilliant throng might be seen Olivero and Ramiro Mattei, sons of Piero Mattei, chancellor of the town, and a daughter of the Pope whose mother was not Rosa Venozza. Besides these, the Pope nominated in consistory Francesco Borgia, Cardinal of the Cosenza, Legate alla Terre, to accompany his daughter to the frontiers of the ecclesiastical states. Also, the Duke of Valentinois sent out messengers into all the cities of Romagna to order that Lucrezia should be received as sovereign lady and mistress. Grand preparations were at once set on foot for the fulfillment of his orders. But the messengers reported that they greatly feared that there would be some grumbling at Cesena, where it will be remembered that Caesar had left Ramiro d'Orco as governor, with plenary powers, to calm the agitation of the town. Now, Ramiro d'Orco had accomplished his task so well that there was nothing more to fear in the way of rebellion, for 1/6 of the inhabitants had perished on the scaffold, and the result of this situation was that it was improbable that the same demonstrations of joy could be expected from a town plunged in mourning that were looked for from Imola, Faenza, and Pesaro. The Duke of Valentinois averted this inconvenience in the prompt and efficacious fashion characteristic of him alone. One morning the inhabitants of Cesena awoke to find a scaffold set up in the square, and upon it the 4 quarters of a man, his head, severed from the trunk, stuck upon the end of a pike. This man was Ramiro d'Orco. No one ever knew by whose hands the scaffold had been raised by night, nor by what executioners the terrible deed had been carried out. But when the Florentine Republic set to ask Machiavelli, their ambassador at Cesena, what he thought of it, he replied, "Magnificent lords, I can tell you nothing concerning the execution of Ramiro d'Orco, except that Caesar Borgia is the prince who best knows how to make and unmake men according to their deserts. Niccolo Machiavelli." The Duke of Valentinois was not disappointed, and the future Duchess of Ferrara was admirably received in every town along her route, and particularly at Cesena. While Lucrece was on her way to Ferrara to meet her fourth husband, Alexandre, and the Duke of Valentinois resolved to make progress in the region of their last conquest, the Duchy of Piombino. The apparent object of this journey was that the new subjects might take their oath to Caesar, and the real object was to form an arsenal in Jacopo da Piano's capital, within the reach of Tuscany, a plan which neither the Pope nor his son had ever seriously abandoned. The two accordingly started from the port of Corneto, with 6 ships, accompanied by a great number of cardinals and prelates, and arrived that same evening in Piombino. The pontifical court made a stay there of several days, partly with the view of making the Duke known to the inhabitants, and also in order to be present at certain ecclesiastical functions, of which the most important was a service held on the 3rd Sunday in Lent, in which the Cardinal of Cosenza sang a mass, and the Pope officiated in state with the Duke and the cardinals. After these solemn functions, the customary pleasures followed, and the Pope summoned the prettiest girls of the country and ordered them to dance their national dances before him. Following on these dances came feasts of unheard-of magnificence, during which the Pope in the sight of all men completely ignored Lent, and did not fast. The object of all these fetes was to scatter abroad a great deal of money, and so to make the Duke of Valentinois popular, while poor Jacopo da Piano was forgotten. When they left Piombino, the Pope and his son visited the island of Elba, where they only stayed long enough to visit the old fortifications and issue orders for the buildings of new ones. Then the illustrious travellers embarked upon their return journey to Rome, but scarcely had they put out to sea when weather became adverse, and the Pope not wishing to put in at Porto Ferrajo, they remained 5 days on board, though they had only 2 days' provisions. During the last 3 days, the Pope lived on fried fish that were caught under great difficulties because of the heavy weather. At last they arrived in sight of Corneto, and there the Duke, who was not on the same vessel as the Pope, seeing that his ship could not get in, had a boat put out, and so was taken ashore. The Pope was obliged to continue on his way towards Pontacole, where at last he arrived, after encountering so violent a tempest that all who were with him were utterly subdued by either sickness or the terror of death. The Pope alone did not show one instant's fear, but remained on the bridge during the storm, sitting on his armchair, invoking the name of Jesus and making the sign of the cross. At last his ship entered the roads of Pontacole, where he landed, and after sending to Corneto to fetch horses, he rejoined the Duke, who was there awaiting him. Then they returned by slow stages, by way of Civita Vecchia and Paolo, and reached Rome after an absence of a month. Almost at the same time D'Albret arrived in quest of his cardinal's hat. He was accompanied by 2 princes of the house of Navarre, who were received not only with those honours which beseemed their rank, but also as brother-in-laws, to whom the Duke was eager to show in what spirit he was contracting this alliance. End of section 22.